ultimately, one of the things that you realize is something that you write can be remembered like years later, and people will keep repeatedly bringing it up. And you step back, and that is where you look at why people remember this. It is not because of the way you wrote, it is because of the compelling nature of the event itself. And you, at that time, were smart enough to see how compelling that was and get out of the way of that particular event. Let the event have its voice and have its space to breathe. And if you did that, people who relived that particular occasion through you and through your writing remember that.
Welcome to the Windowpane sessions. Windowpane is a writing community formed by past participants of the online writing course I teach, The Art of Clear Writing, linked in the notes below. We have reading groups and book clubs, writing prompts and feedback. We have a newsletter, which is not active at the time of recording, but will be by the time you see this on YouTube. And we have workshops with amazing writers. We've had Akar Patel and Nilanjana Roy on this before. And today we have a man who needs no introduction. Time magazine has described him as Kerala's finest export. The Times of India called him the world's foremost panicker. Salman Khan referred to him as the kind of Prem I have always wanted to be. We are all devotees of this man. You could call us Prem Pujaris. Prem Panicker, welcome to the Windowpane sessions.
Thanks, Amit. Thanks for having me on. Partly, it feels kind of odd because I'm an alum of your workshop. And also, partly, I mean, one of the joys of being in this particular group is what you guys have done, because I also hold workshops occasionally. And that's it. I mean, we do follow ups. You keep getting mails from people and you respond. But those are individual exercises, right? But the fact that you were able to bring a community, and if I remember correctly from the mail thread I saw earlier, another group has just joined today and become part of this larger community. The fact that you're able to build it and the fact that the community is now self-sustaining and running by itself, I think it's huge. I don't think it's happened before. It's definitely not happened on this scale. So, total pleasure.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you were, of course, a participant in my course, but that was just your kindness. You did possibly just to hang out with a friend because we've known each other for so long. I don't think you had anything at all to learn from me. Now, the format of the show for our viewers is that I'll be chatting with Prem for about 5-10 minutes. About things I've always wanted to ask him, and then Prem will give a brief presentation on insights that he has about sports writing and writing in general, and then we'll have Q&A where various members of this community will join in and ask questions and interact. So that's broadly the format of this, which is very awkward for me because once I start asking questions, as you are aware, it can go on for many hours. I want to kind of talk about what your early influences were. Like I just released an episode of The Seen and the Unseen with a friend called Raghu Sanjay Lal Jetli, which is a pseudonym, but he's essentially the same age as I am. And while chatting with him, I realized that the first time I saw a computer was when I was in my 20s, right? And I'm guessing it would have been similar for you, if not kind of later. And that got me to thinking about how we form our influences when it comes to what we read and what we write. Like today, everybody watching this has a world of information at their fingertips. They can access all the writing guides, sign up for writing courses. You and I have nothing. We are in pre-liberalization India. We are growing up. We've both been privileged enough, I guess, to have access to books, but even those are not all the knowledge in the world. They're kind of piecemeal things here and there. And even when we become writers, there's no sort of ethic of writing that we can imbibe about journalism. We are just following whatever local practices there are and wherever we happen to work. So tell me about Prem Panicker as a young reader. What kind of things did you read, and when did you kind of cross that threshold where you start thinking about the thinking about language and thinking about writing itself?
Yeah, I think I was a listener before I was a reader because I grew up in this joint family in a place called Calicut, Kozhikode, in to give it its actual name. Um, the advantage of that particular life was one that at that time we didn't have electricity. Electricity hadn't come home. So the evening ritual was that um, a lamp is lit, and a little puja happens before the tulasi plant and stuff, and then the lamp is kept in the center of the courtyard, which is where the family gathers until it's time for dinner. And during those times, one of the advantages, I suppose, I just got lucky, was that uh, my grandfather, my grandmother, two of my uncles, two of my aunts, they were all brilliant storytellers. Three of them were actual Sanskrit pandits who they used to play a version of Antakshari, which was Sanskrit slokas. So they had the Vedas, the Puranas, and all that memorized. And so they would take it in turn to tell stories. Even the normal discussions in the house would somehow end up with a parallel drawn to a story from the Mahabharata or whatever. So for me, early days it was listening, and then gradually discovering the joys of reading. Initially, because I was growing up in that household, English books were pretty much a rarity. It was all Malayalam, which is what I started reading first. And then when I was 11 and a half years old is when my parents went in this ancestral home. They were in Chennai earning a living. And I suppose I was left back because they couldn't burden the sun when both of them were working so hard. When I went to Chennai, it was a whole other thing because my dad was equally a voracious reader, and he read a lot of Malayalam, but he also read a lot of English. And so my reading was, you said piecemeal, and that's the word that perfectly fits the case, because it was it was a matter of reading what dad already had. And so it was a kind of weird mix of the Russian novelists and short story writers. Georgette Heyer, because my mom, also a reader, she loved Georgette Heyer. Dad was a Woodhouse fan, so there were a lot of Woodhouse around the place. There was Agatha Christie's and Perry Masons, and for some weird reason, I don't know where he got this fanboy moment from, but he used to love reading westerns. So you had the Zane Greys and Max Brands and J.T. Edsons and all of that, and so that is what you read, Raphael Sabatini. And so you start getting a bit of historical fiction and start getting attracted to that. Uh, One of the things I remember, and of course the newspapers, and there was a magazine called Sport and Pastime at the time. If you remember, it was edited by Nawab of Towdy. Had some fairly decent sports writing. This was before guys like Nirmal Shekhar and young Rohit Brijnath had joined and started writing. But even back then, mostly it was K.N. Prabhu, Raju Bharatan, that era of writers. So those were what you got, and what you read. Even though you started developing preferences, you couldn't follow up on those preferences the way you can today. You read a particular genre, and you're attracted by it. It's a simple matter to go on online and the books you want in that particular genre. Those days, it didn't matter what you read what you got. So a lot of it was serendipity. You discovered things by accident. There was a place called Moor Market, which old time Madras people will remember. It was one of those heritage buildings, and anyone who came on a visit to Chennai would be taken to Moor Market. And whoever was your guide would tell you Moor Market is one place where you can get everything from a pin to a plane. Uh, I don't know about the plane, but you got pretty much everything. Uh, and inside of Moor Market, there was this quadrangle which was devoted entirely to secondhand books. It's a brilliant place. It is just planks of wood, books piled under it, over it, in between it, and in the walkway, and you kind of gingerly pick your way among books. Dad used to have this habit of every fortnight he would go to Moor Market. So he would take with him from the previous lot of books that he had bought, the ones he didn't want to keep. He thought it was one-time reading. He would take all that. He would sell that, and he would have budgeted in his mind a certain amount that he thought he could spend, and then he would start buying books. So because of Raphael Sabatini, Alexander Dumas would be an obvious choice because, again, the same genre. But then he would also look to explore and pick up books. And finally, when he came to these last 2 or 3 rupees, he would go to where books were being just given away, literally. The reason why I remember that is there was this, and mom and I used to wait on those days for him to come in. He would come in, he would drop his bags, he would go in for a bath, and we would start rummaging among the books to see what each of us wanted to read first. And there was this one time, I think I was 13 or 14 maybe, and dad came back with this book called The Sweet Science by A.J. Liebling. And mom was the one who picked it out of the bag, and she looks at it and she looks at me. And when dad comes out of the bath, says, "What's wrong with you? Boxing, really?" And dad said, "You know what? I got it for 75 paise, so I just picked it up. That's the money that was left." Uh, I read that, and that was kind of epiphany. That was when I realized what sports writing really could be, as opposed to what I had been exposed to in the newspapers and stuff, which is very, when you think of it today, it was very sort of basic. Here, sport was was being described in such a visceral fashion that it took you there. You felt the pain of the boxers. You felt the energy. The You really knew what they were writing about. And I had never seen a boxing bout in my life, but it spoke to me, and that made me, I think, start looking up books on boxing. So as I grew up and I had my own pocket money and I could make these forays to more market and stuff, I started looking for books on sport. And that kind of, I think, started the whole thing. So it was sport, it was historical fiction, it was a humor, obviously, Woodhouse and stuff. And I suppose you could call it literature. It was just exploration. You come across a Charles Dickens, you come across a later, you come across a Steinbeck, and you come across Faulkner, people like that, and it was all serendipitous. It was based on what was available, what was inexpensive, what I could afford, and you read that. And I think I would have to have been in my very late 20s. I was 29 when I came to Bombay. And that is when I managed to start actually following my own interests and reading those authors, more and more of those authors that I wanted. And then, of course, 1995, the internet opened the whole thing up. So you could actually get a better view.
Yeah, thinking
Yeah.
back on your writing, I can obviously see the influence of writers like Liebling. But what sort of strikes me as unique about your writing, and why you stand out? Like I once commented that one can read a paragraph of a Prem Panicker piece and know exactly who has written it. And what sort of makes it identifiable and a unique voice in that sense is, number one, it's a storytelling. And I wonder if that had something to do with your childhood, like you said, listening to stories. Because even when you're writing a piece of commentary, or even when you're writing about a particular moment in time on a cricket field, there is so much storytelling going on, which makes it so rich and engrosses the reader and all of that. And the other aspect of it is the interweaving of the personal into everything that you do, where your involvement with sports and with life itself is obviously deep and visceral, and that comes out through your writing because you're just sort of putting yourself in your writing, as it were. Now my question sort of is that, is this something that were characteristics of you right from the start when you started writing, or over a period of time as you grew confident of your craft, you realized that yes, storytelling is great, that yes, I should not be scared of the personal and of putting the I in the piece, as it were? Many writers are told, don't put an I in the piece, don't make it
Yeah.
about you, but you do that, and by doing that you make it about so much more than you. How has your thinking on your voice and how you evolved it sort of grown over the years?
I think it was luck more than anything else, in the sense that, yeah, you pointed out, you pointed to what I had said earlier about growing up in a family of storytellers. So I got into writing or into journalism because I wanted to tell stories. I was not, the reason why I haven't written an autobiography, I guess, is because there's only one title that fits. And Robert Lipsyte of the New York Times stole it. An accidental sports writer. His memoir is called that. Sports writing was completely an accident, even though I loved sport. Uh, but I got into this because I wanted to tell stories. And I got very lucky in that. Um, Initially, it was Vijayan Kanampalli, who was then the editor of Ammo Kanampalli's father, who was then the editor of Free Press Journal, who gave me my first job. He kind of left me alone to do whatever I wanted. There would be times when he would call me in and give me some feedback, but that feedback mostly was on the lines of, "This is not too clear to me," or "I don't think you have sufficient facts to make this conclusion," things like that. But he never talked to me about voice. Uh, I'm a college dropout. I'd never had any formal training in journalism. So it was basically just telling stories the only way I knew how, which was making it a narrative. And then after about 6 months, Nikhil Lakshman took over at the Indian Post. He had seen something that I had written. Apparently, he liked it. So he called me and said, "Will you join me?" And I went there. And again, Nikhil just threw it open to me. And there was what he did, and for which I'm perennially grateful to him for, is he never told me how to write. He never prescribed what I should do. What he did instead was, when I wrote a profile, for instance, I remember that he went shopping in the secondhand bookshops of Andheri and he picked up old copies of Esquire magazine, which was my introduction to Esquire. And he gave me those magazines and said, "Read this. This is how the real masters do profiles." And it was not just picking up whatever Esquire was available. He would look for something that had been written by, say, Tom Wolfe or a Mailer or a Tallis or somebody like that. And he would actually flag those stories and say, "Read this." And if I wanted to, I could go back to him and discuss it and say, "Can I actually do that? Can I use dialogue?" You don't know. So you're kind of, I think, in broadly speaking, the advantage that I had, and it was an incredible piece of luck, was that people just let me be. And they didn't try to tell me what to do, what is not done. So a lot of it I had to figure out for myself. I would do things, I would read the piece afterwards, I'd be pissed off with it. I'd realized that I'd missed opportunities, buried leads, maybe made 100 mistakes, and then you sort of learned from it, and you also learned from what you read. So once I got introduced to Esquire, I made it a point to try and find every copy that I could. Esquire led me to the New Yorker, which led me to through which I discovered, say, Vanity Fair, all of that. So basically, I don't think I was influenced by a particular thing. I was influenced by people who pretty much were content to let me make my own mistakes, find my own way, and not mess with what was coming to me instinctively.
That's very resonant with me, and I'll just take a moment to point out that one of the best editors I have worked with, Sambit Bal in Wisdom and then Cricinfo, had exactly that same approach towards the young writers he hired. Like, one, he was a magnet for great talent, barring me, and I'm probably an exception. But you had people like Rahul Bhattacharya and Rahul Bhatia, Chandrahas Chaudhary, and many S Rajesh, many fine writers at Cricinfo. And his approach was exactly this: he would let people make their own mistakes. I remember when I joined him in 2001, I was so callow, so bad. All the participants of this course would laugh if they could see my writing then. But Sambit just gave me the space to make my mistakes and learn and grow that way. Now, my next question to you is about the 90s, where a very interesting thing happened, and there was sort of a movement in two directions at the same time, in cricket writing especially. And one of them is commented upon, and that part which is commented upon, where everything changed, is that the British newspapers like the Guardian, Telegraph, Observer, whatever, they realized that the nature of their sports coverage needs to change, because information is now a commodity. Everybody knows what has happened in the match. They watch the match on TV. There is the internet. There is no need to tell people the bare bone details, and therefore a lot of the match reports would have color, would have commentary, would have perspective. So they kind of took a step back from the detail, because they assumed you already knew the detail, and they took a sort of broader lens. Now, at the same time, in the subcontinent, a very interesting and almost opposite thing is happening. I sometimes tell people when they talk about how I was an early blogger in the early 2000s, I say no, no, no. Prem was the world's first blogger in 1995 because you were doing that ball by ball commentary for Rediff and those match reports for Rediff, and there you went in the other direction because part of your audience there was diaspora, young Indian students in the US, desperate to get as much information as they can about these matches. So your match reports would last, I remember, thousands of words. At lunch you'd put a report which was massive, which described every detail, every over. You'd do another one at tea time, and these massive reports almost became a signature. And in a sense, you were an outlier because when I became a serious cricket writer, everywhere, you sort of valued economy, precision, crispness, all of those things. And on the other hand, there is Prem Panicker, the one man army, playing to a different set of imperatives and producing incredibly rich, resonant writing, which I know has stayed with so many of those young people who would read you in those times. Tell me a bit about the thought process behind that and how your writing evolved as a result of those new imperatives.
Yeah, I think the period that you're talking about is late 95, 96 onwards, because the first time I wrote sport was the 96 World Cup. Rediff had a soft launch in December of 95 and a hard launch in the first week of January 96. February 14th was the World Cup. And one of the problems that we had at the time was the internet itself was unfamiliar to people in India. And when you try to hire for the internet, there weren't too many people who were willing to join because they couldn't quite figure out what the heck this was. And having established bylines in print, they weren't willing to go into a medium where the first thing you told them was not too many people in India have the internet. I mean, you could count them in the hundreds maximum. The connections were about 500 or so when we launched. So, like you said, the first thing that occurs to you, and because we couldn't hire any, I suppose Ajit Balakrishnan, who was the publisher and the owner of Rediff, and Nikhil kind of looked around the room, and I was the only one faffing around, so they said, "You do the match reports," which is where this whole thing kind of began. Because my early days in the Indian Post, you had the Crasto brothers, Daryl and Ivan and the others. They handle the sports section. So there was no question of my doing anything with sport. It was occupied. I went to Midday, and Sharda Ogra and Hema Lashar were the heads of the sports desk, and they were absolutely talented young kids at the time, absolutely brilliant in what they do. So again, there was no opportunity for me or the need for me. From there, I went to a Sunday Observer, where I was doing the features magazine. I was both editing and writing for it. So again, no sport. So suddenly this came to me, and what I remember doing at the time was I had about 4 days between being told that I was going to do this and actually having to cover the first match. So I went to this place called the Documentation Center in Bombay, which has all these archival material. Nobody even goes there now because the internet is your documentation center. But those days, this was a place where things were clipped and kept in files. They were coded. So if you asked for, say, India's tour of X in this year, they went and brought you that file, and you could go through it. You could Xerox what you wanted. So I read a lot of those reports, and I tried to read it from the point of view of the people I would be talking to, which was the diaspora. And the first thing that strikes you about them was they were completely blind to the game. They had no means of seeing it. Around 2000, if you remember, Willow TV came in, and that was the first time that you could actually see live cricket. But the period 96 to 2000, there was no way that if you were outside of India, you had no means of tuning in. So initially it was reports, and I realized that the problem with I wouldn't call it a problem. What struck me about the reports that I read from the newspaper archives and stuff was that it didn't give me a sense of what had actually happened. It hit highlights, but the rest of it was kind of a prose version of a scoreboard. X came and took 5 wickets. The other guy scored a century. This fellow played some brilliant shots. None of it So I tried to visualize the game reading this report, and nothing, I couldn't see the game. So I remember initially being told that in the early days of the internet, you were supposed to write one scroll, is what they told you. One scroll is about 300 words once you strip off all the masthead and all the rest of it, right? So when I had to write that first report, I realized that there was no way I could tell a story of a cricket match in those 300 words. So I was like, the hell with it. I'm going to tell the story and it takes whatever it takes. And I just wrote. And mercifully, it was a day night thing, I think, or though that time zone thing. So by the time I published it, the publisher wasn't around. He had gone home. He only saw it next morning, and he came to me saying, "What the hell have you done? This is about 5 pages long, and you don't do that on the internet. You know how long it takes to load and all of that." But people from abroad started sending in their feedback, and the feedback was uniformly, "This feels like we watched the match." So that kind of accidentally became a thing. And it was, I think, after the 2000s, and you mentioned that period in cricket for where there's this efflorescence of talent. Bhattacharya, Bhatia, Chandrahas, Siddharth Vaidyanathan was one of the names. There was you. I remember you doing, besides your writing, also doing things like Between the Wickets, where you would have a theme and then you would ask one person to write about it, then another person, and it grew as a conversation, which I thought was absolutely stunning. I think you asked me to do one of those. Um, I thought that was a brilliant idea. I think it is around that time that you then had to reformulate and say, look, people are seeing the match, so you don't have to start from the toss and the teams. All of that information is now accessible. Now you're looking at what, when you sit back and watch a sporting event, how does it impact on you? Because ultimately it is visceral. Sport is visceral. We interact with it, right? We don't just consume it like we would consume financial news or whatever. So I had to then rethink and redo. And I think there was that period. Okay, all you guys started doing absolutely brilliant stuff. There was, and what happens when you do match reports ball by ball? I mean, you start the match doing ball by ball, and I once figured out that it was about 50,000 words per day by the time you were done. And then you wrote the report, and then you had to write the columns and stuff. You do that for 5 years, and a lot of cricket is anodyne. There's nothing really to write about. Uh, what was happening was I was phoning it in, frankly. And my personal moment of catharsis came when somebody started a parody blog, a parody of a Prem Panicker match report. And I saw that, and I realized that, I mean, it was humorous, but it was dead on accurate. I was doing that. I'd created some templates in my head and I was just filling in the blanks. So around 2000, I stopped. I stopped writing. I told my editor that I didn't want to do cricket anymore because I thought I had forgotten how to write. Um, After that, I didn't do much. I think I did the 2003 World Cup and then the 2006 World Cup T20, but that's about it. After that, I wanted to write only when I wanted to write, when there was something that was happening which impacted on me, and which goes to your question about the I realized that that was fine. I was talking to fans of sport, and all of us, we may not write on sport, but there is an I in our consumption of sport. I like watching this guy, or I don't like what happened in this particular uh, game, or this particular period of play or whatever. It is not divorced from us, right? It very much a part of us. So I didn't see what was wrong with bringing myself into the story, my reactions, the way I process the events. I found that it gave me a lens with which to show people not just what happened, but how I reacted with it. And the feedback would be from people who reacted in their own ways. Some of them agreed, a lot of them disagreed. But that disagreement showed me how different people were processing the exact same event. And that made me, the next time, I was also aware of alternate ways of seeing and feeling and yeah, processing that thing. So that's where that came from, basically.
Yeah, I mean,
It all because of that one parody account.
No, what you said about getting stuck in a template of your writing and all that is resonant, because what I often find is, I talk in my course about how we should avoid cliches and all of that, because they make the reader's eyes glaze over and all that. And cliches are not just words and phrases; they can also be structures and formats and kind of ways of writing and all of that, which can become a problem. And my final question before I sort of we go to your presentation and we go to the Q&A, is that in terms of sports writing, you've done all kinds of writing. You've done brilliant writing on so many things, including especially in these current times on politics. And in fact, I wish you wrote more, and you wrote many books, as I've kept telling you through the years. But what are the unique challenges and lessons that sports writing holds? Because at one level, it strikes me that there is always something happening. You don't really have to search for a story, because there are so many stories embedded. There are actions on the field, there are the other dramas between the players, human dramas, there's backstory. It's very rich, it's all there. At the same time, I often used to warn myself as a young writer, once I became self-conscious enough or self-aware enough to notice this, that the tendency as a sports writer is often to try and build drama into everything. Because you are writing a piece, you want the piece to be great, so even if what you're describing wasn't, mind boggling, you are trying to find the drama, and you might go too far. It reminds me of, I think Wally Hammond once described, Amar Singh's ball as coming off the pitch like the cracks of doom, like off the cracks of doom, which is
The crack of doom, yeah.
so incredibly hyperbolic, and it's a memorable phrase, but in a sense, it doesn't really, um, um, really get into the specifics of what's kind of going on there. And that's also a balance you have to draw, where you want to capture the drama, but you don't want to go too far. So, and which is not there to the same extent in any other kind of writing. So what was that like for you? What were the challenges and lessons which are unique to sports writing?
I think the single biggest challenge is the one that you pointed out, that not every event is memorable. Not every day's play is worth a lot of adjectives. I mean, you talked about the crack of doom. Look at the number of match reports where you say something like Virat Kohli played a series of brilliant cover drives. Now, a ball that is on the fourth stump line on a good length spot, your foot is pointing towards extra cover, your bat is coming in that line, just thing, and you're playing with the full flow of the bat, hitting it almost on the half volley. That's a cover drive. What's a brilliant cover drive? What does it mean to the reader? It means nothing, right? But that's what we reduce a lot of sport to, and just breaking that habit, trying to, if something was brilliant, try and explain why it was brilliant. Your former colleague Sidvi used to do that. Remember, he would take one instance or one episode or just one ball, and you write an entire piece on that. That is one of the challenges that I found almost insurmountable. I mean, you keep trying. Um, the parallel blessing was, by the time I was self-aware enough to realize what I was doing and that it wasn't working, I had access to so many great sports writers and sports books, initially through the internet, then through, through the increased ability to buy the books that you wanted. And you realize that you got to that point where you realize two things. One, if something was boring, you can call it boring, because chances are the fans felt that it was boring too. So if you try to make something interesting which the fan felt was fairly anodyne, he would switch off. So I learned to call it as I saw it. I mean, my nightmare is doing ball by ball commentary and then match reports about that Sri Lankan series where these guys just batted for 3 days or 4 days or whatever it was. And I remember spending 2 days writing things like Anil Kumble bowls outside the off stump and Manama drives through the covers for. Anil Kumble bowls on the off stump, Manama drives through mid off for. That was it for 2 days. And how the hell do you make that interesting? I remember there was this famous sports writer who once gave this bit of advice. He said, if you can't write a good piece, just write a piece. Don't push yourself. Don't push the subject. Don't push yourself. And there's this Paul Salopek, who's a two-time Pulitzer winner. He and I and Aarti Kumar Rao and Don Belt taught a series of workshops. And I remember this story that Paul told us. He was talking about a poet, an American poet called John Gage, who was back in the day, he was giving a radio interview, and the interviewer towards the end asked about process. So John said, I walk into my room where I normally write, and there are cats around, and we have a couple of pet dogs and all that. And I shoo them all out of the room and then shut the door. So the interviewer interviewer in her hurry, she said, oh, when you're alone, you sit and write. He says, yeah, well, I sit down at the table and I realize that I'm not entirely alone because looking over my shoulder are all the people who wish me well, all the people who expect something from me, the people who I have idolized and live up to. All of them are peering over my shoulder. So I sit quietly and I wait for all of them to leave the room. So the interviewer again goes, oh, then you write. She says, no. I then realize that there is still one more person in the room. That's me. And I wait for that me to get out of the room and only the story is left. That's the one thing that I just everything else off. Look at what the event was, look at what it is saying, and just write exactly what it was. If it was boring, there is absolutely no harm in doing a 200-word thing saying, look, guys, nothing much happened. There's a famous review of a Broadway play, which was just one line. Ex actress barged down the Nile as Cleopatra and sank. That was it. I mean, it was a bad play. What the hell else are you going to say, right? I think that was one of both the challenge and the learning was to not force yourself onto the story and to not force the story into something that it is intrinsically not. Because one of the things that I've realized is that readers are very good at spotting fakes. Readers are very good at spotting a sham. Readers are good at spotting when your heart is not really in what you've written. So yeah,
Yeah, that's well said. Everyone has a
that
bullshit detector. Great that you mentioned Siddharth Vaidyanathan, and even Osman Samyuddin, another fine writer. I forgot to
right.
mention. Like Sambit has just like like Lord Shiva just birthed so many
Yeah.
creatures around the place, which is kind of fabulous. And again, going back to the cliches, what you said about the brilliant cover drive is evocative because one of the examples I use in my course is how elegant cover drive has become a cliche. Wherever you see cover drive, you will see
Hmm.
elegant. Wherever you see accurate
Elegant.
accuracy, you will see metronomic accuracy. And the point is that look, Virat Kohli and Mark Waugh and Rahul Dravid all play elegant cover drives, but they're all different from each other, and that's the
Different.
challenge for
Yeah,
the writer
exactly.
to communicate that
Yeah. I mean,
difference.
I'd love for somebody to write about how, for instance, when Virat, in his pomp, not in the early part of his innings, but in his pomp, when he plays the cover drive, there's this moment when he is reaching well away from the body and the ball seems to be stuck to the bat for that split second before he snaps his wrist. And he uses that snap of the wrist to guide it into wherever the gap is. And it spans the spectrum from, say, wide mid off all the way to cover point, probably. And it's just that it's Kohli's equivalent of Jordan's hang time, for instance, where he's there for that split second more than ordinary mortals. I'd love that kind of writing. I'd wish to see much more of that. Tell me why something was good. Don't tell me something was good. I saw it, as we all do, right? I mean, we watched the match. We saw that he played some brilliant shots. Tell me why this particular. You can talk about Lakshman playing an inside-out square drive, but tell me the mechanics about how the ball was a foot and a half outside the leg stump. So he had to run around it. He then had to take possession, and then he had to play it in a direction that ball geometrically, according to the laws of cricket, it's not supposed to go. That makes for great writing. And yeah, I mean, it's the people you mentioned, uh, the masters of that, but so few masters. So
Yeah, no, I'm smiling because as all the participants here may have noticed that you can do this shit even when you're talking. Other people have to sit down and carefully craft it, and that's a beautiful moment you described with the ball stuck to Virat Kohli's bat, and you're it's so
yeah,
cinematic. You're creating a freeze frame, and then whoop, it kind of goes. That's beautiful. Let's move on now to your presentation, and after
sure.
that, we'll take questions from the gathered crowd. You want to share your screen?
Yeah, I'll do that. So this is not a presentation. In the first place, I'm going to keep this very brief, and I just wanted to touch on a couple of thoughts. It's not necessarily only about sports writing; it is writing in general. And these thoughts came. or I decided to use these thoughts because I am a member of your group. I occasionally see your writings and things, and a few things occurred to me over time. So I just condensed that into a very quick slideshow. Um, this is the first thing. This I don't know if an empirical study has been done of this, but there is a hell of a lot of advice for writers out there, and I'm not dissing the advice that is there. I'm not dissing workshops and all the other various ways in which uh, people who want to write or who want to get better at writing seek to improve their craft. What I'm trying to say is, if you just keep imbibing all this advice that comes and you start fitting it into your own writing craft, you're pretty much going to end up with a structure that is a bit like antilla. Uh, Things sticking out all over the place and somewhat unaesthetic. And I'll get back to this in a bit, but just keep this point in mind. This is the same point, but it was made by Alan Watson. It's something that I have on my pinboard just to the left of where I'm sitting. Uh, the minute we start talking process, craft, how do we do this? How do we do that? This is the kind of question that I get in every single workshop. And I'm like, first, write before you start getting into the intricacies of it. You will figure things out in time. But the minute you start thinking too much about all these process related questions, you are like the centipede, which can't figure out which foot to move first. Um, this is what you do. You build from your basics. And the basics of writing, ultimately, it is the story and your working vocabulary. These two things coming together is the fundamental part of writing. Everything else builds from there. And over time, you build. I think in that conversation one of the things that came about was, at least I don't know about others, but I certainly wasn't a finished. I'm not a finished writer even now. One of the reasons Amit said I was taking his course out of generosity. No, I had taken his course. I've taken Jared Kimber's. I go to News University and take courses there when I think the subject is something that I want to learn about, because there is always something more to learn. There is always something to reinvent about yourself. And again, from that conversation, you would have noticed that we talk about how times change, and as times change, the requirement from the audience side changes, and the writer has to learn and to adapt to that, or you just become part of the past. You're no longer relevant to your audience. So I would say focus on the basics, and absolute basic is this. Think about this kind of cave painting, just plain black on white. It's about 60,000 years old. That is the oldest cave painting that has been discovered till date. So think about that guy, right? The guy who did this. Along with his mates, he went, he hunted for his food, he killed something, he brought it back to his cave, he broiled it, he ate it. And then he picked up a burning brand from that fire, and he walked into his cave, and he found a blank space on the wall, and he told the story of his hunt on the walls of the cave. He did this 60,000 years ago. The instinct to tell stories is so atavistic in us that it perennially surprises me when people say, how do I write? How do I tell a story? You tell a story by getting back to those, to that instinct, and not by thinking too much about process, the craft. What you do is you focus on the story itself. Look at this. Look at how much we've evolved as storytellers. This thing is about 15,000 years old. It is still predates language, spoken or written. But by this time, people have discovered the use of color. They've discovered the use of depth. They've discovered the use of perspective. They've discovered the use of narrative, because it's not just a series of scrawls and scribbles on that wall. There is a story being told there. And people are doing this 15,000 years ago. So for me, it is that. And so what do we mean when we say, tell me a story? There's a Pulitzer Prize winner called Tom French, who once I was asking him for, this was a period when I was in the US, and I was extremely underconfident about my work, my writing. I thought by then I'd gone through this whole cricket mill and I realized that I was phoning it in. I realized that I'd forgotten the basics. I realized I'd forgotten how to write. And I asked him for a recommendation of books that could kind of show me my way back. And one of the books he recommended, in fact, he said, this is the single book that you should read. It is the DC Comics Guide to Writing Comics. He said, learn to write in scenes, learn to see scenes in the first place, and then to evoke those scenes. And if you look at this is what it is all about, right? Here's what I'd like you to do for me: make me laugh, make me cry, show me my place in the world, show me the world's place in my life, lift me out of my skin and put me inside another's, and show me what it is like to live there. Show me the places I've never been to. Carry me to the ends of time and space. Give my demons names, give my fears a face, and show me how to confront them. Present before me heroes who will give me courage and hope. Demonstrate for me the possibilities I had never thought of. Ease my sorrows, increase my joy, teach me compassion, entertain me, enchant me, enlighten me. Above all, tell me a story. Just to segue for a moment into sports writing specifically, one of my favorite sports writers of all time is a Sports Illustrated writer called Gary Smith. There's a book called Beyond the Game, which is a which has a collection of some of his best works. In fact, if you do Gary Smith and Prem Panicker, if you Google that, I remember writing a blog post linking to a lot of his best stories, which are available in the Sports Illustrated archives, and a lot of them are free to read. He wrote this. He said, sport comes to us in boxes within the perimeters of our TV screens or the boundary lines of fields and courts. As much as I enjoy what goes on inside those boxes, I've always felt the urge to bust out of them. I've always had the feeling that the most compelling and significant story was the one occurring beyond the game, before it, after it, above it, or under it, deep in the furnace of the psyche. Conventional journalism couldn't always carry me up to those rafters or down to those boiler rooms. So I had to break out of a few of my own little boxes as well. For me, this is sports writing in a nutshell. What is happening within the perimeters of our TV screen is accessible by everybody today. What is happening on the boundary lines, what is happening outside the boundary lines, what is happening in terms of conflict. And when you start thinking of conflict and resolution, for instance, that is where the story is today. Those are the things that in the heat of the moment you don't pick up. That is what a good writer will actually focus on when an event is on, and that is what he will evoke when he writes after the event. um, I'm fairly certain this question, I think I saw a question where I can tell you a story that shows you how this is done. So I'll save it for that. I also wanted to talk because, again, I see this coming quite often, style versus voice. So I just wanted to spend a moment on this. This is basically what style is, and the two things are not the same. Style is basically using words to engage the human mind, and the more you do it, the better you get at it. Here is a piece that was, I'll tell you who wrote the piece later. We all know about the Silk Road, right? It is legendary. It's actually the historian Peter Frankopan has a book called The Silk Road. And if you go to Amazon.com or .in, and if you do a search for Silk Road, you will find dozens of books that either have it in the title or in the subtitle or in the contents. Uh, and look at how this is written. It wasn't a road, which is where he starts from. It's a paradox. You're writing about the Silk Road, and the first thing you're saying is there is no road. Less a highway, it was a diffuse web, a shifting skein of thousands of camel trails, mountain pass bottlenecks, turreted caravanserais, river bazaars, seaports, and lonely desert cairns, spaced eyeshot apart for navigation, that bound together two great economic centers of the classical world, Han China and the Roman Mediterranean. Notice something. The first line is just about 4 words. The second line is about, if I remember correctly, it's 73 or so. And yet, the subordinate clauses are done in such a way that the eye shifts and the mind shifts with it without losing track of where you are. And then he goes into the next paragraph, which deepens the earlier one. At its geographic crossroads in Central Asia, where kingdoms of middlemen grew rich, the Silk Road's goods flowed radially in all directions: north to the Russian principalities, south to Persia and the Indus, west to Constantinople, east to Xi'an. This network of commerce linked tens of millions of lives as far away as Africa and Southeast Asia. Look at how he creates a rhythm. There was this long drum roll right in the second paragraph, which kind of establishes a bass rhythm, and then he starts increasing the frequency, increasing the beat. It gets staccato into this third paragraph, and then he rounds it all up. Look at that last paragraph. The Silk Road wasn't a camel rug worn in the step, it was an idea, the prototype for globalization. So he starts with that paradox, he explains the paradox at the end, and the way he structures it, this is style. This was written by Paul Salopek sometime in 2016. If you ask Paul, did you actually sit there and plan this a way of writing, look at the rhythms, look at the beat, decide when you would have a long sentence and when you would have these shorter sentences, he will tell you no. He wrote it as it came to him. The reason why he is able to do this is because of tons and tons of the writing that he has done and learning every single time from what he writes and from what he reads. I've seen him, we've walked across parts of northern India, particularly Rajasthan, in the blazing heat of summer. We would have walked 35 kilometers, sometimes 40 kilometers in a day. And at the end of it, all you want to do is just stretch and somehow try and get some sleep. This guy has this little light on and he's either reading or writing. That's where style comes from. Mastery comes from doing something over and over again and being aware of what you're doing, being aware of what is working, but also of what is not working, and then trying to figure out how you can make it work. This is from George Leonard's book called Mastery. It's a mysterious process during which what is at first difficult becomes progressively easier and more pleasurable through practice. You don't, when you're writing, sit there and say, I'm going to create this effect or I'm going to create that effect. What happens basically is when you're reading something and it seems to work, not just at the level of information, but also at the level of an aesthetic, you imbibe that sometimes unconsciously, but it's all there. And when we say we're writing from instinct, that instinct is basically all that you have learned and imbibed over time, both from your own doing things and from what others have done. And it comes to you when you need it. You just need to let it happen. And then voice. And Nilanjana Roy, who was here on Windowpane the last time, put it. It's something that stuck with me. She wrote this somewhere. Voice isn't a pebble on a beach full of pebbles. All of us already have a voice. I know it's not the done thing now, but back in the day when a baby was born, they'd lift it up by the heels and spank its bottom to make it cry and clear its lungs. That sound that on when the baby feels that spank, that sound of anger and pain and outrage, that's your natural voice. Our problem is not, so when we say I'm looking to find my voice, you already have it. Your problem is not that you can't find your voice. Your problem is that you haven't given yourself permission to use the voice that you have. You're constantly looking for something external, whereas voice is intrinsic. This is voice. It's a child's way of looking at the thing. It's a very uncomplicated way. Look, the child is not concerned with rules. You've got a blazing hot sun and right next to that a rainbow. It doesn't happen. But that's how the child sees that world. It's a happy place. And the child has even carved a little heart inside the door, which peeping toms would have loved. But again, the child is not concerned. He's got everything, he or she. The kid who drew this, she's got something interesting cooking inside the kitchen. So you have the smoke of the cooking fire. She's got clouds. She's got trees, birds, bees, butterflies. It's a very uncomplicated, straightforward way of telling a story, of conveying an emotion. And that is your basic. Remember, I started with that. Go back to your basics. Your basic is a very uncomplicated storytelling voice. And the day we find that, that is when we get the material to start building on. This is the point. It's like a thumbprint. Style you can learn. You actually do learn style both by doing and redoing, and also by reading the stylists. But voice cannot be learned. It should not be learned. You shouldn't be looking at somebody else's work to try and learn voice and how to use it. You should be looking within yourself. Who are you? That dictates your voice. And like I said, I was bringing up these points because I noticed that after the workshop and before the workshops and all that. These are constant tropes that come up both on the WhatsApp group and sometimes in the email threads as well. So I think I'm going to stop there, and this should be about interaction. It should be about question and answer. So
Prem, thanks a ton. That was
mhm.
incredibly fascinating, and a lot of it resonated with me. And I have a further question that I ask of all writers because it's something I'm so curious about and something I struggle with. But before that, a couple of observations. It's interesting that when you showed Paul's beautiful paragraph there where everything is so natural, and you pointed out that he didn't consciously think about that. I'm amazed you didn't do an
Mhm.
analogy with our favorite sport, cricket, because that's how, say, a Virat Kohli or Rohit Sharma, they become what they are. They are not
Yes,
consciously thinking at the moment that they play that cover drive of the world's fastest bowler, that where are my feet, where is my elbow, is my head still. All of those habits they internalize over thousands of hours in the nets of being mindful of first principles. And there also, Prem, I agree with you that there's so much writing advice that rather than look at specific little rules and guidelines, we should have these broad first principles in our mind and build our frame of looking at writing like that. And that's what the Virat Kohlis, or in any field, people who achieve excellence will do, where they will iterate endlessly, do something again and again till it is part of instinct and they don't even have to think about it. And the other point there is, what I noticed was how in that passage which you pointed out, style was a slave to substance.
yes,
When people try to do things with words and show how good they are with the language, but it's not serving whatever the purpose of the piece is, then it distracts the reader from that narrative. And what Paul did so beautifully there was, the style in a sense was invisible. If you're reading it, you won't even notice that there is a writer, unless you are lovers of the craft like all of us. It'll just have that sort of magical effect on you. And what you said about voice is also resonant, because the constant advice I give, especially in my podcasting course, where people talk about ki market mein ye gap hai, wo karna hai, and all I say is that look, there are already more than a million podcasts out there, and the only thing that will make your podcast unique is you. So you have to be authentic to yourself, and that applies to writing more than anything else. That is the only way that you lose that self consciousness. And one test of this is, if you read out what you have written, does it sound like you? And it should sound like you, obviously without the ums and the ahs and all of that, but it should sound natural to you. And that's when you know that it's getting somewhere. Now the question I have is, what you said about that incredible piece of advice, just right, which can be such a great slogan. And I keep talking about the sort of the trade-off between getting it done and getting it right, where too many of us are too obsessed with getting it right, and we let that paralyze us. And what is important is just to get it done. Just get it done. Do a first draft, make it a dump
yeah.
of the brain, then chisel it, then work on it, then all of that. So my question to you is that I have noticed with great jealousy and even bitterness that how does this man write so much? You'll write thousands of words in a day. You'll just sit down and they'll just come. Whereas when I sit down, I am just struggling. It is agonizing. It is painful. What have your writing processes been like a great batsman, like a VVS Lakshman with that cover drive? Are you making something very difficult look very easy? Do you have to work much harder than it looks, or do you have any hacks or tricks which can help you just sort of write so much and not fresh churning out stuff, because it's high quality stuff? You're always at that baseline level at least. So what's your process like? How do you do it?
I mean, to go back to the cricket analogy that you used, I remember reading someplace that, and I then adapted it to the writing process. I remember reading someplace that when somebody is bowling at 140K and you are facing, try blinking. In the time that it takes you to blink and open your eyes again, the ball is past you. So there really is no, so it's not instinct, it's not just muscle memory, it's a mix of everything, right? It's that process that is drilled into you, or you have drilled into yourself over and over again, that lets you do all these computations of line and length, and what is the second line going to be, and therefore what are my best possible responses, all in the time that it takes you to blink. For me, initially, what used to happen was I would get stuck on some of the bits and pieces of writing. So I'd spend a lot of time thinking about a lead. and that used to ruin my writing for me. It made it difficult. Occasionally, I would go to the extent of I would have worked very hard on a lead, and from there I transitioned to the early part of the exposition and stuff, and suddenly realized that I've written myself into a cul-de-sac. I've somehow the lead I chose was not right for the story. I think what changed for me was when I reminded myself that, again, it is that John Gates thing, right? It needed to be the story and nothing else but the story. So the only process I have really is, one is deciding whether I want to write about something or not. And increasingly, it's not just because it was a great game, I don't want to write about it. Can I, is there something that about it that speaks to me? Is there something that is that evokes some kind of visceral reaction? Then that dictates the sort of tone and the mood of my piece. Then what I do is all the material that I have, when I'm watching, I'm constantly taking notes. I never go anywhere without this little thing in my pocket, and a whole bunch of these things, pencils. I need that irrespective. I could be going out for a social event and I still have this. When a match is going on, I'm constantly making notes. Is I don't even know if I'm going to write. I don't know if I'm going to use all this material, but I want that. I want that material. And when I'm done, and I decide that I want to write something about it, about 4.5 feet, 5 feet from where I'm sitting right now, there's a treadmill. So what I generally do is turn it on, get on it, and I walk this thing through in my head. Why do I want to write this? What is it I want to write? What is it that I'm trying to tell you? What is it that I'm trying to make you experience? And I see if I can get clarity on that in my head. Basically, it's a 10-minute process of looking at your material. And sometimes I just decide to disengage. I think maybe something that attracted me, but when I explore it a little bit deeper, it really doesn't mean anything much. But when I do decide to engage, I'm just walking through that and making sure that I know what I want to say. And then I think it's that gauge thing of, you come there and you just say, right, it's the story, and I forget about everything else. The lead is what comes naturally. I'm not trying to force it. It's the logical entry point. I think there is a question about a lead coming up somewhere along the way, so I'll save the rest of it for then. But yeah, that's pretty much all the process I have. I just want clarity about whether I want to write about this, and if so, what I want to write. I mean, when I say I don't write if I don't think I have something, it's the caveat obviously is somebody has commissioned you to write and is paying you to write, then yeah, fine, you do the best with the material you have.
Fair enough. And we'll move on now to our first question. And, waiting to ask you a question is Ravi. Ravi, go ahead.
Prem, so good to see you. You just mentioned in your presentation something about style and voice, and I had pasted this on the chat. So I thought maybe it's a stupid question, but why not just ask it, right? Which is you said you can learn style, you can do that, but voice has to be your own, right? So
Mhm.
I was not sure what was meant. So my question is, what's the difference between voice and style?
Look, style is all the aesthetic elements, right? Aristotle wrote a book called On Rhetoric, another one called Poetics, which pretty much condense how, from the time of the ancient Greeks, the aesthetic elements that go into making a piece of writing stylish, for want of a better word. Think of things like the use of alliteration, for instance, the use of tricolons, the use of threes. All of these used right, or in that example that I pointed out in the presentation, that piece from Paul Salopek, the rhythm of sentences, all of that is style. It is an aesthetic arrangement of the material which allows you to engage with the material but also gives you that aesthetic I just repeated the word aesthetic twice in the sentence, but it's the one word that fits the purpose. It gives that aesthetic quality to the piece. Voice comes from, there is an event, you're writing about it, right? Now, the event in its bare bones thing, something happened, let's say it's a cricket match. Okay, one team played and they did XYZ, the other team did whatever it was. Certain bowlers performed in a particular fashion, certain batsmen performed in a particular fashion. All of that is flattened out. Everybody's voice is exactly that. If they're reading out a scoreboard, you read out a scoreboard, I read out a scoreboard, it's going to be the same thing. You write on that event, I write on that event. It's going to be different. Why? Because you process these things differently. And how do you process things? It is one is the way you look at the sport, but it's also the way we process things. And this is not just sport, it's anything. It is a matter of it is a combination of the circumstances in which we grew up, the way we learned, what we learned, how we learned, how we got into writing, the influences that there have been on us, not just about writing but also about our values, our value systems. All of that uh, determine voice, right? Let's say that somebody takes a purely aesthetic enjoyment in watching a day of cricket. So if you think back to the Chennai first test, that first day, if I had to write a match report, my thing would be everybody wrote about how brilliant Joe Root was. My personal voice, I'm writing that report. I'm writing about how easy it is to get suckered into these kind of narratives because there was nothing brilliant about it. It was a flat deck. There was nothing happening. Nothing happened in the air. Nothing happened off the wicket for either fast bowlers or spinners. It didn't matter whether it was leg spin, off spin, whatever type of bowling it was. It was just a road. And on that road, a highly accomplished batsman just batted on and on and on. What is brilliant about it? It's the least that you expect from that, right? Now, that is voice. The way I say it, my arrangement of words, my the rhythm of my sentences, all of that is the style part. But the way I process that is a matter of who I am. Does that help?
Yeah. So I was saying that the voice itself, you gave this example of the newborn baby, right? You slap on its feet, and there's a voice, right? So that means the voice is something very fundamental to the person, right? So it's as if you're born with a voice, but then if you think of voice as a point of view, you could change it, right? You could say that I'm going to, speak from a different side, and therefore your voice would be different, right? And
No,
of
no,
course,
no.
I get the idea about the style. That is clear, right? Am I going
Hmm.
to do it like a
Hmm.
op-ed or a poem or a
Sure.
what, right? Or
Yeah.
a story, right?
Yeah.
That's clear. The voice part looks to me like is a choice versus being something that you want to kind of discover in yourself, or you just do what you want to do. So that part,
See, sometime earlier in this on the chat side, I noticed somebody referencing a piece that I'd written about Gauri Lankesh when she died. Right now, that's an event. Gauri Lankesh was shot dead. People wrote about it in many ways, and this goes to your point about you can choose to write it like this or like that. Some treated it like news, which it was. Gauri Lankesh was shot. Some treated it like, for want of a better word, an editorial or an op-ed where they started talking about repression, about intolerance, about how that has
hmm,
enabled people to pick up a gun and to shoot down a voice they disagree with. What I wrote was from a sense of loss. For me, Gauri, not necessarily her writings alone, because a lot of her writing was in a language that I do not read. I've read her English writing, but Gauri was, for me, a constant reminder of something that is fundamental to why I am who I am and why I am in this profession. To be able to call it as I see it. And I wrote from that point of view. That is my voice coming out about the same event, right?
so,
And I could have impersonal look at what intolerance means, and how this growing intolerance allows people that liberty, if you will, of just gunning down somebody they disagree with.
yes.
But that wouldn't be a natural voice. That would be writing to a particular template. I'm expected to write an op-ed, therefore I can't be doing what I did in my piece. But when you are writing for yourself, or without having already been put into one of these boxes, that natural voice is what I'm talking about when I say you have it already. Think of it this way: if you had an experience on your way home from wherever you went this morning, and you came back, and I was in your place at that time, you walked in and you start telling me about that experience, the way you would say it instinctively, that's your voice.
Okay, got it.
You're not at that time trying to think in terms of what is a good lead, how do I enter the, you know what happened to me, and off you go, right?
Right.
That's the natural voice that I'm talking about. And the closer you get every time you write or speak to that natural voice, the better it works for you.
Understood. Understood. Got it.
So, Prem, just to sort of elaborate to that and add a little bit of a nuance, which might also be a slight difference, is that we could think of voice as who we are and style as how we present ourselves and how we kind of communicate to others. But the one nuance I'd add here is that the voice I think you've been speaking about is, say, the voice of a non-fiction writer through his non-fiction, and many fiction writers through all their work. But equally, it's possible that a novel may have a particular voice and another novel by the same writer may have a different voice that she has adopted to for a particular effect. For example,
Yes.
Salman Rushdie's Midnight's Children has such a different voice from Harun and the Sea of Stories, which have a different voice from all his non-fiction, because he's speaking in a different way to different kinds of people, and his non-fiction voice is pretty much consistent all the way through. But for fiction, you adopt particular voices. Let's move on now to a question by Sarthak.
Perfect. Thank you so much for doing this, Prem. So my question was about the lead, and you mentioned something very important that I've already noted down, is that the story is the king, and it kind of informs the lead. So this comes from personal struggle. Is like you mentioned for yourself. Is, say I picked up the test match. For this test match, it was handed out Johnny Bairstow's amazing short selection. But for most other pieces, I kind of sit and I think of what can be a good lead, what is a good way to, paint a picture in the first two words. Now, you posted your article with Sindhu versus Okuhara, which was epics have ordinary, even commonplace beginnings. I would like to read just two sentences of the two initial sentences of Fly, Lara, Fly, which is my favorite piece by Rahul Bhattacharya. It says, Lara is a beautiful name,
Yeah.
rhythmic, small, and epic. Uh, to come back to my question, how do you go about constructing something like this?
So I think I pointed out in that initial conversation with Amit that I knew nothing when I was lucky enough to get a job as a journalist, and I had to figure things out one by one. Right, the first thing that I heard about leads is the lead should be intriguing to the reader. It should get the reader to start reading the piece. It took me a while to figure out. Think of an analogy from, say, the movies. You might have a terrific beginning, right? And you're hooked, and you're literally edge of the seat. And the next thing you know, you have an absolutely out of place item song or whatever. And then it meanders off into a segue that you can't quite connect up with what went before. And you start fidgeting and you start looking for the exit, right? It's not axiomatic. It's not that if your lead is brilliantly constructed, the reader will read through to the end. It is, so instead of looking at it from the point of view of the reader, it took me a while to realize that I had to look at it from the point of view of the story. What I wanted my lead to do was not the hook for the reader, but the hook on which I could hang the infrastructure of my story. So I needed an entry point which would then allow me to develop my story step by step all the way through to the end. I needed to know where I was taking this piece. I didn't have to write the ending in my head before I sat down to write, but I needed to know where this piece would end. What was the note it was going to end in? I needed to be completely familiar with my material, because you brought up that Sindhu Okuhara piece. See, I knew I was going to write that piece.
Right.
I knew it before the match itself, right? So the first thing I had to do was I looked at the choreographs of those two players. When did they start playing? What was their initial results like, all the way to that moment? Then I looked at the head-to-head, and I realized that Sindhu had won the first match, and then after that you had Okuhara winning three in succession. Then Sindhu gradually started finding her way back. And I was intrigued by the score lines because they all seemed to be very close. They were all, I think, except one. All of them were three setters, and they would be decided by the final 2 points. So just for the hell of it, I tallied up the points scored by Sindhu and scored by Okuhara across their head-to-heads. And I realized that they had played, if I remember correctly, 590 points from the time they started playing in 2014 to that point in time. And it was all dead even.
Right.
So after all these games, 6 or 7 games, there was nothing separating these two players. So that is a point for me. And initially, I thought that was a good lead. Then the match begins. And so you start looking at all sorts of things, right? You look at what is happening in the court. For instance, in the first set, if I remember correctly, there was a 43 stroke rally. But you also look at the sidelines. For instance, every time there is a break, it's either a water break or a change of ends or whatever, you find that Sindhu, the first thing she does, she asks a question to Gopi, her coach, and then she's drinking water and listening frantically to the response, and then she's asking something else, and she's completely trying to absorb what her coach is telling her. And also, when the play is on, if you notice, one of the things that Gopi does is he's sitting on the sidelines. He's only saying 2 words: "Stay calm, stay calm." That's all he said. So you're looking at that and you're writing that down, and then you're looking at Okuhara, for instance, and you see her coaches are far more vehement. Unlike Gopi, who seems to be softly explaining something, you see them passionate and they're very "what are you doing" kind of thing. And you see her listening to all of that, and then she comes to the sidelines just before she enters the court, and she gives herself that moment of calm. She talks to herself. You can visibly see her lips move, and then she bows. So I looked up that bow and exactly what its significance was. It's a big bow of reverence. And every single time she was stepping onto the court, even if it was just to change a bat, she would do that.
Right.
So you write that and you slowly start, then you see the players, right? And you see that both of them are fundamentally different. They're different as people. One is alpha, one is almost unobtrusive. You don't even see her until the shuttle falls in a particular place, and there she is. Then you look at playing styles and you think, oh, okay, this one is all about touch and artistry and very deft little deceptive strokes. The other one, Sindhu, is all about power and stuff. And at some time, you start rethinking that because Sindhu plays some brilliantly deft touches,
Right.
and Okuhara smashes beautifully. There was a sequence, if I remember correctly, where the three successive smashes that sent Sindhu literally reeling. She fails to return the third one. That made me wonder what it was like, what the reaction time was like. I went and looked up what the speed of smashes are, and I realized that it is over 340K. You're separated by about 20 feet or so,
Right.
and you're trying to process that. So what is happening at this time is you're collecting material basically. Then that 73 stroke rally happened, and again, I was making notes as it went along. One of the things that struck me was at that time was the camera, if I remember correctly, was behind Sindhu, facing Okuhara, and just behind Okuhara, there was this guy with these two plastic, blow up balloon kind of things, banging
Right.
them together, making a noise. And at some point, he gave up. And the last part of the rally plays out in total silence. Uh, and you're thinking of that, and you realize that the rally lasted for, if I remember correctly, a minute and 13 or 14 seconds. That is 74 seconds, 73 strokes at this speed. And the enormity of it all, the enormity of what these two did in that one passage of play. So at various times in this process, various things strike you as being a good entry point into it. You could have written about the fact that there was absolutely nothing to separate these two contestants coming into the match. That could have
Right.
been a lead. The personality traits of these two contestants could have been worked into a lead. But suddenly this happens and you realize this is your lead. Then you're thinking, okay, how do I use this best? There are two ways, right? One is you describe the entire rally, and then you talk about all the other things. You talk about how these two are such different players. You talk about their individual styles. And somewhere along the way, you mention what happened in the match and how it all ended and all of that. But if you think about it, those are two discrete chunks.
Right.
There is the description of the rally, And then suddenly there is all the rest of the stuff, which didn't seem to me to serve the purpose. So then I mercifully, we live in the days where almost immediately after an event you can go to YouTube and search for something and it's there. So there were replays of this rally, so I just kept watching it in segments, as the play shifted, as one player gained dominance, then the other one, the parity was restored and stuff. And I made notes about how many strokes each took and how that played out. And I realized that various times juxtaposed with various points that I could make. So for me, the lead was the rally. It was just a matter of how can I use that to drive my narrative. It was not enough just to hook you. In which case, I would have probably, if all I had to do was hook you, I would have probably talked about there was a moment when Sindhu completely out of position does a no look shot with a forehand facing the opposite direction, which the Chinese thought was a double touch because there was no way. I mean, it didn't seem logically possible that she could have pulled it off. That would have been a great lead, but it didn't serve the purpose of taking me deeper into the story. So for me, I'm not concerned about whether I'm using the lead to get you hooked into the story. I think if the story is strong, you will read. If the story is weak, no matter how bad the lead, you're not going to read. So for me, I want the lead to be something onto which I can hook the rest of my story.
I hear you. Right.
All the way through to the conclusion. So it's just the first link in a chain, for instance.
Right. But then
Does that make sense?
you're 100%. And thank you so much for going into such detail. Just one last question so that I can kind of find closure in this is that with the lead, you're also very cognizant that this lead is also going to inform the rest of my storyline per se. And that lead cannot exist in its own entity. Like it has to be a logical start to this thing.
Yeah, exactly. And it also has to sort of, in a way, set up where you're taking the piece at the end. So if you go back to that Paul Salopek thing, and if you guys want, I can send you a link to the piece later on WhatsApp or whatever. If you go back to that piece, he starts with "It wasn't a road," right?
Right.
And the last thing he says is, "It wasn't a road. It was not a camel rut in the steppe. It was the prototype of globalization." So in the lead, he's already foreshadowing the ending. You don't realize it at the time, but it falls into place perfectly. And the lead and the ending bookend the exposition that was in between. That is a perfect choice of lead.
Right.
It has to resonate. It doesn't have to necessarily set up the ending, but it has to work with the ending at some point in some fashion.
I hear you. Thank you so much, Prem.
Prem, that was just superb. This it felt like a masterclass in your process, and it also tells you that it's not as simple as just sitting down and writing. The way you go into all of these details and for the richness that they bring you. So that was fun. And now let's have a question from Priya. Priya, go ahead.
Hey Priya, how are you doing?
I'm good, Prem. How are you?
I'm well, thanks.
So this is slightly non-sports territory. The question. So I remember during one of your earlier sessions, I think it was part of Takshila, you were talking a lot about John Steinbeck's works. And this is related to one of his work called Travels with Charlie in Search of America. And in the introduction to the book, the Jay Parney, who is introducing the book, says that Steinbeck took liberties with facts, invents when it serves its purposes, using everything in his arsenal of the novelist to make this book a readable, vivid narrative. My question is two parts. One, how much liberty is too much liberty when writing a travelogue, and how necessary it is to stay true to the facts, to stay on the track, how much liberty do you have to conjure up characters, interviews, and everything, and how is it okay because it contributes to the narrative? And part two is how much of fictionalizing is acceptable when you're writing the biography of a person, and this is not necessarily a famous person, but say for example like Raghu Karnad's book on about his maternal I think grandparent it was, where he fictionalizes a large part of the story because there was no letters or no voice of his grand uncle or his grandparent talking about what happened during that period of time. So he fictionalizes a lot of the story. So, and would it be still be okay to call it a biography, or, should it just be called fiction straight up?
So the first part of your question about Steinbeck, I think one of the things with Steinbeck is that he was a reporter before he became a fiction writer. In fact, Grapes of Wrath was basically the fictionalized story of the Great Depression, which he reported on initially. The broad answer is it depends on what you're writing. If you're writing fiction, and if you're clearly flagging it as fiction, you are obviously making things up. But if you're writing fact, then there is no such thing as liberty to make up things. If you have to invent characters to make something come alive, to make something vivid, you flag it. Here's the thing. The problem here is, suppose you're writing a factual account of an incident or an event or a play, so whatever, you're reporting on an environmental issue, for instance. And this is getting published, right? Now, suppose you made up parts of it. The problem is that sooner or later, somebody from that area is going to figure out that what you did was just make up stuff. And that comes out into the open. And now what has happened is you've made up one little thing to paper over a crack in your narrative, or an area where you needed something that you didn't have. And now your entire piece, whether it's the size of a book or whether it's an essay or a long form narrative or whatever, the entire thing is gone. It's devalued, and you are never trusted as a writer again. So if you're writing fact, stick to fact, and 100% of the time, if your story is not coming across, if you're not able to make a point because there is something missing, then that something missing was you in the field or during your research not doing your work properly. You didn't take the trouble. You didn't see the story evolving in your head, and therefore you didn't realize there was this chink, and therefore you didn't look for what it is. And the answer is not come back here and make it up. Then I might as well make up the entire thing by myself, right? There's a book called Chasing the Monsoon by Alexander Frater. It starts with, in the district of Trivandrum, a little village from where he sees the monsoon coming in off of the Arabian Sea, right? There's a brilliant description in there about the Mela-like atmosphere that happens, kids playing football and all that. I'm sorry, I grew up there. I was as recently as last year, year before last, 2019, I was in that exact place reporting on the degrading coastline. Nobody plays football when the monsoon is coming in, because when the monsoon comes in, dust gets everywhere. I mean, you could be standing out there in your clothes plus a raincoat plus all kinds of covering, and then you go back to your room, you take it off, and you will see dust coming out of your underwear. So I'm not making it up. It's impossible to describe that combination of rain and wind and stuff like that. So if you saw people playing football, that was not the entry of the monsoon into the coast. You dressed it up. And why do you want to do that? Just the stark spectacle of this curtain of rain coming in off the sea is so incredible that you really didn't need this artifice. To your point about a bio, again, I'm guessing that there will be times in a bio, for instance, if I had to write a biography of, let's say, my grandmother, who literally raised me from when I was a baby, there'll be large holes. My grandmother lived in a peculiar time when Keralite women did not actually have to marry somebody. They could just invite that person home as a consort and stay with that person for as long as she wanted him there, and then kick him out when she decided that she had had enough. And her first relationship was like that. She called a guy over as a consort. She had a kid by him and then asked him to leave. Then she got married. That was my grandfather. All of that. Now, Parts of it I know from having been curious enough to ask my grandmother questions and to ask elders from that generation about what that life was like and stuff. Parts of it I can extrapolate from. There are great books on that period, so I can take from there a lot of information that fits into this narrative. Again, with, by the way, acknowledgement. Um, I might have to make up parts of dialogues and stuff because I wasn't there. I wasn't recording everything, right? But I'll have to find a way, at least in the preface or in the afterword or whatever, to flag what has been made up and why it has been used. Ultimately, look, the way you deal with facts, your fidelity to fact determines one thing, that's your credibility. You lose that, I don't care how good a writer you are, you just don't get read. Look at the number of people who've been turfed out of this profession simply for making things up. Some of them were excellent reporters. You can't even wrap your head around why the hell did you do this? So I think the answer is a flat no, you can't make things up. If it's a factual story, no, you don't. If you have a gap, you have a gap. You just learn from that. You say, okay, next time. Because in the field, if you're spending 4 or 5 days in the field, a good practice is you come back in the evening, go back through your day, see what you've got. You don't have to actually write everything down, but at least write little notes. I got this, there was this interview. Think about what you got and see what questions occur to you. That'll tell you what you still don't have. And you have the next day to go and fill up those gaps. That is how you come back from the field with a narrative that holds together. And if by chance something was just not available, then it wasn't available. That's it. So yeah, please don't make stuff up.
Sure.
Unless it's fiction, in which case make everything up.
That sounds good, Prem. Thanks so much. Thanks.
Sure.
In fact, I would add that even if it's fiction, don't make everything up. Otherwise. But I'd add to that I think Priya sort of meant a sort of more nuanced version of that, where there is a twilight zone where when you are writing facts, you are still trying to dramatize. Especially for the sports writers, there's an urge to dramatize, like the allegedly brilliant Joe Root innings you spoke of, or somebody will just go in at the end of the day and like bat 40 balls of a brilliant session, and he's just doing his job, playing ball by ball, and people will praise his courage after the fact, which is something that Keith Miller was once exasperated and said that what is bravery? This is not bravery. Bravery is a Messerschmitt up your ass. He was Messerschmitt is a German plane, forgive my pronunciation, and he was referring to that. And I think this urge to dramatize also introduces an element of fiction in fact, but is kind of unavoidable. Let's move on now to the next question by Subramanya.
Hi Prem, thanks for doing this. My question is around opinions and bias.
Absolutely. Pleasure.
Every sports writer is also a fan of a sports team or a player or of an issue. There are certain opinions. And I get that there are positive reasons to use one's own opinions and bias, but it could also result in a certain set of situations, right? So how do you use it effectively? What are the pros and cons of using one's own bias? I mean, I could give examples as well. One example is in the Chennai pitch, for example. It is a highly opinionated issue right now with different people taking different positions. So, broadly, what are the pros and cons of using one's own bias in writing about a sports or a team or an individual or an issue surrounding the sport?
Look, I suppose different people have different answers for this. Speaking for myself, the first thing I had to wrap my head around is the fact that I'm human and bias is part of the human condition. The only way I know how to get rid of bias is to lobotomize myself. As long as I'm who I am biased. I'm biased in favor of certain things. I'm biased against certain things. I like certain players. I like what they bring to the sport. Another person playing the exact same strokes, for instance, I may not like as much. All of that exists. And trying to avoid bias so much as you try not to write from your bias. So, for example, you don't, just because you like a particular person, there are times when absolutely brilliant players manage to put up some runs, 50, 100, whatever it is, but it is clearly not what they are celebrated for, let's say. Tendulkar has played ordinary hundreds or ordinary knocks. He's had to restrain himself. He's had to bat in a fashion that is not him. That is not why I watch him. So has Virat Kohli very recently, for instance, that 74 odd that he scored, where he cut out his cover drive, he cut out pretty much all the strokes. He was willing to be beaten over and over and over again and still somehow just dig in and, something here. I I may be a fan of the way Virat plays cricket, but using that that fanboy element in me to then say that this was a brilliant innings is fairly daft. It's what you try and warn yourself against. It is perfectly okay for a good player to have an ordinary day. It's perfectly okay for an ordinary player to have a great day. So when you're sitting down to write, it's not that you're avoiding your biases. I suppose it will show in little things like, fingers crossed. I actually made this prediction on Clubhouse that before the series is over, Shubman Gill will actually have an innings of substance. I love watching that boy bat. And I'll probably, if I had to write about it, I'd probably give a little bit more space to him because I like him. But you're equally aware of your biases. So therefore, when you feel the urge to celebrate something or to condemn something, you take that step back and ask if it is really what it merits, or is it coming from a bias? And if it's coming from a bias, then you move away. Otherwise, you make a fool of yourself, as a lot of pundits have made fools of themselves about the Chippewa pitch, for instance, the Chennai pitch, for instance.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, Prem. People have opinion and they should use it. But perspective was very helpful. Thank you so much.
Speaking of biases, Prem, let's face it, you are here because you have a bias for us, and we are grateful for that particular bias. Let's move on now to the next question. This is from Uday. Uday, go right ahead.
Hi, Prem. Thanks for doing this. I've been one of those diaspora guys who's always been sitting in front of the Rediff website, refreshing, and I've always been constantly amazed. The reports after lunch, at some point of time, used to come after 3 refreshes. And I used to be amazed at how could you come out with this detailed, nuanced storytelling, ball by ball, and you were also doing the ball by ball. So, I know Amit's asked about it in the earlier part of the conversation, and we also talked about how the entire Rediff journey happened. But just take me through. I'd love to know how you kind of built up this incredible capability. I think in the WhatsApp chat also in a couple of months back, I did ask you, is it almost the same thing like how the war journalists can come up with such incredible pieces from the trench lines? So that stuff about Rediff is something which kind of still bamboozles me.
I think I made the point earlier. A lot of what I've done in my life, I stumbled on by accident, not by design. And this was a funny accident because back when I dropped out of college, and back in those days before liberalization and opportunities started opening up in all kinds of fields of employment, you either became a government employee or a bank employee or something, or you were nobody. So I wasn't getting a job, basically just faffing around, playing drums for a while for a band and serving as a waiter somewhere and stuff. And there was this constant din in my ears from my parents about, at least prepare yourself for a stenographer's job, because all those dreams we had of you becoming a doctor or an IAS officer and all that are gone. So they kept nagging at me about learn shorthand and typing. And I was refusing. So in the street next to my place, there was this shorthand typing institute run by a retired bureaucrat. And one day I was walking past that, I was going somewhere, and I saw this incredibly beautiful girl going in, and I realized that she was actually a student. So I figured the only way I was going to get to know her was maybe join that class. So I did. And I didn't get the girl. I didn't even get close. But I learned typing. So that was one accident that helped this whole thing. How do you do ball by ball and still get a match report out? I think what happens when you do ball by ball is, and I'm truly grateful that it actually, that people still remember this, because sport is very ephemeral, and writing about sport is even more so. Because I mean, next day, what is it worth, right? I mean, you wrap your fish in it. The time I did ball by ball and match reports and all that was pretty much ended in the 2000s when I stopped doing ball by ball. In 2000 itself, actually. Uh, 20 years later, for somebody to bring it up feels good. What happens in ball by ball, or at least the way I was doing it, was I wasn't doing outside the off stump plate into the covers for whatever. I was actually describing where the ball landed and how the batsman played, right? So when there was a moment that was there in that moment, but it was also part of the larger narrative that was forming in my head as I was watching the play, I would type it out, but then I would promptly cut paste it into a file. So by the end of a session, I would have a lot of these elements already in place. I obviously didn't want to use the same words that I had used in the ball by ball commentary. There were times when I wanted to expand on certain things. Some I decided to cut out, but I had all my raw material. So what I had to do was write an entry and an exit paragraph, and then order these in sequence, and then clean them up and put them up. So it's like it's like my friend Nakul Shenoy talks about magic, and he says, I mean, sometimes he explains things to me, and then I say, oh shit, it's this simple. I didn't want to do that because I prefer the mystique of this guy can actually do ball by ball and in 5 minutes write a 2,000-word match report. No, it was actually being written while the game was. And even the cleaning up was actually done. There are these breaks in play when the field is being set, or there's some batsman is called for some drinks, so something or the other is happening. Cricket gives you a lot of interstitial time, which is when you can quickly go back to your Word document and start playing around with what you've written, and do discrete paragraphs or chunks and keep them ready. So that's how it came about.
That was awesome. One of the words that kind of comes to me is that, and not just this question, even the ones that you were talking, is that a lot of presence. I mean, you were totally clued on every moment of your thing, and that kind of comes the whole presence of being alive to that moment and taking that entire narrative forward. It was incredible. Thank you, Prem. Really appreciate this.
So, Prem, at this moment in time, there is a lady, perhaps somewhere in Kerala, who is looking back in time and thinking, oh, that is the cute boy who followed me into the typing class. I really should have spoken to him. And I just want to, before we go to our next question, I just want to add something about those Rediff days and what it meant to a lot of people. Prem, I remember, I think you'd once in the early 2000s showed me feedback or fan mail that you got. And what basically used to happen, for people who are not aware, is that a lot of these diaspora kids in the US would live together in dorms, or they'd be sharing rooms, and they'd work in shifts. So one of them would stay up for 3 hours, say between midnight and 3 in the morning, following Prem's commentary. That's the only way they are getting to know about the match. Then he wakes up, the other guy goes to sleep, the other guy then follows Prem's commentary, and then they all wake up in the morning and they're all reading the match reports together. So it occupied a sort of a unique space in the emotional landscape of Indian fans of a certain age and time, which I want to point out to people who were probably born after that. Who knows? The next question is from Ritu.
Hey,
Hi,
Ritu.
Prem. Hi. I'm not at all into cricket, but I'm not even out of it. Like I have huge fans, my family, my friends. So I've been hearing so much about it. I have read about it, bits here and there. So my question centers around this thing that most of the cricket writing, I mean, barring a few, most of them, it's very adulatory. I mean, it's all about praise of gods, in service of gods. So what are the reasons? I mean, is it that the market demand, or readers' preferences, or it could be because, I want to bring up the topic of access journalism. Is it about that? Thank you.
Ritu, it's a bit of all of that, really. One of the things about hanging out with or being part of events where the main participants are so immensely followed is that you hope a bit of that stardust rubs off on you. So yeah, you want to be there. And by association, you become somebody or the other. I remember, for instance, this Bangalore Literature Festival some years back. And I'd been roped in to help, not organized really, but on the day, take writers for the coffee that they needed, or show them the way to whatever it was, or look after any issues that came up and stuff. And for one day, actually for 2 days, I think I had been running around doing all of this. And barring a few people who knew me personally, nobody gave me any kind of never mind. And then on the early morning of the third day, Rajdeep Sadesai was releasing his book, something Democracy is 11 or some such. And Rahul Dravid was releasing the copy, and there was a panel discussion which I was moderating. And after I came back from the stage, Rahul left and Rajdeep went off to do whatever else it was. And after I got down, I had all kinds of people coming up and saying, "Oh, I've been this and I'm a huge," and I'm like, "Dude, I saw you yesterday and you didn't even know me from Adam." So there is a bit of that. I don't want to spoil my access to these people by writing that he wasn't particularly impressive this day or whatever. That's a huge issue. Secondly, I think we get sucked into the glamour of this whole thing, and then there is, I don't know what the equivalent of buyer's remorse is, but maybe buyer's bias or whatever. How do you actually sit down to write a match report and manage to dismiss it saying nothing much happened? You can't, right? So you're desperately looking for something to talk up and to hype and stuff like that. So on the one hand, and I can promise you that if you're consistently critical, whether you're a radio commentator, a television commentator or a writer or a reporter or whatever, you are going to be denied access. That's for certain sure. So it does play a very big role in the way you are and in what you write and how you write it and how you frame whatever you have to say. Part of it is us buying into this whole culture that we are part of. We want to remain part of it, and we want the joys of that proximity. And one way is to keep on the good side of people, write nice things about them. A lot of cricketers say that they don't read what is written, but they all do, or most of them do, and they remember. As I've known to my cost both ways, been denied access, but also been given access by some cricketers who thought that I was being fair and honest. And so, yeah, I'll talk to you, that kind of thing. But yeah, access journalism is a huge problem. It's not just cricket, though. It's pretty much everywhere.
Right. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. I'm reminded of my years in Cricinfo and the dilemmas we faced. And my policy always there was keep a distance from the cricketers so that I can write what the hell I want and I don't need the access. But everybody doesn't have that luxury. Some people are actually reporting day by day, every day from the ground, and they can't lose access. And maybe they stick to reporting the facts, and other people like me sitting somewhere else can kind of write the comment pieces. Our next question is from Sanjay. Sanjay, go right ahead.
Hey, Sanjay.
Hi,
Good
Prem.
evening.
It was good evening. It was great stuff, great conversation with Amit, and I enjoyed
Thank
your
you.
presentation. So my question is related to writing in general. So for a newbie like me, who is not a journalist, how do I access publication? How do I publish a piece that I have written? What should be the process that I should follow? Are there any tricks which you can tell us? Thank you.
There's no trick to getting published. I can only say that it's easier to be published today than it was before the internet came along and so many avenues opened up. If you think back to those times, you had maybe 2 or 3 newspapers, and those newspapers all had correspondence covering whatever it was, and you never got to write. So it was not easy. How do you get published? It is hit or miss, really. If you have a great story idea, you could pitch. The first thing to do, I think, is what is it that attracts you? What is it that you want to write about? It could be anything. It could be sport, a particular sport, for instance, or it could be the economy or politics or the environment or whatever. Be aware of what you're pitching to whom. For instance, don't pitch an environmental. I'm using a very obvious example. Don't pitch an environmental story to a Cricinfo, right? But more nuanced, look through that particular publication and see if they accept those kind of pieces. Do they carry, suppose environmental journalism is your thing, do they carry environmental stories on a fairly regular basis? And if they do, are they all from in-house writers or are they also external? Write a proper pitch. A lot of pitches that come to editors starts with, I'm XYZ and I've been working as a whoever, whatever you've been, and I have always wanted to write, and therefore I'm writing this thing, and my interests are this, and blah 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 blah. And I swear to God, before I've gotten halfway through that, I've just clicked delete and moved on. Uh, the editor's role is, she has got a lot of space to fill, with various themes and stories on various themes and stuff. And you need good stories. Every editor needs good stories. And that is particularly true in these days when staff strength is getting reduced, when people are being laid off, when there are less and less people at your disposal to send out for stories and stuff. So the fact that an editor needs a story is a given. And what the editor wants to know is not who you are, but what you want to write about. That's the first thing you tell them. Your opening paragraph is, this is my story. Your next thing is, this is why I'm equipped to write that story. Not about where you studied, and nobody cares. Like I said, I couldn't even do an educational qualification thing because I don't have an educational qualification. So I mean, that hasn't prevented people from publishing me. Frankly, your qualifications don't matter. What I want to know is, if say, again, I'm using the environmental example just wisely, but I'll stick with that. If you're pitching me an environment story, you're saying something like, the coastline is getting eroded at a frantic rate, and this is what is happening, and this is the angle I want to take, and this is the story I want to tell. I also want to know, what is it about you that makes you able to tell that story? Is it the fact that you are rooted in that place and you know what is going on, or is it that you have some specialist knowledge about it? Are you an expert on tides and erosion and all of that, or what is that? What is your USP? And thirdly, have you written something that I can see, right? um, that is your entry point. You keep pitching and you will find that a lot of them go into the void. There is no response, and that is just how life is. um, Sometimes you will get a response saying, this is not the story we're looking for, but keep in touch and stuff like that. It always pays to keep in touch. It doesn't pay to keep nagging a media house that you've already pitched to. It is absolutely acceptable to wait for a week and then write back saying, I'd sent a letter, I hope you received it. If you have the time, please let me know whether I can work on this piece or not. But you do get people who will call you and then ping you on WhatsApp and send you reminders and all that. That doesn't work. If the editor wanted it, they would have gotten in touch with you. But overall, in today's ecosystem, one of the things that I would recommend is, if you have an interest area or several interest areas that you want to write about, and I'm assuming nonfiction because fiction is a whole other beast and I'm not qualified to talk about that. You should ask Amit, who's done both. But if you're talking of nonfiction, one recommendation I would make is use the internet. There are blogs, there are podcasts, there are multiple ways, even a Twitter thread where you're making nuanced, efficient points and stuff like that. Because guess what? Editors these days, increasingly, like I said, we are all desperate to get stories. And the staff at, I'm using our very loosely because now I'm freelance entirely, but the staff at the editor's disposal is also shrinking. So you have to find voices. You have to find something is happening somewhere, and the thought in your head is, God, who is qualified to write about this? And guess where we find our leads? On social media. Somebody posts about something and links to something they've written. I go back and read that, and next thing I know, I'm calling you up and saying, hey, are you able to write on this particular subject, because we need this piece. So it's a chicken and egg thing, right? If you're constantly waiting for an editor to get in touch with you and give you a gig, it may not happen, because how the hell does the editor know to find you in the first place? What I would do is build a body of work. I would do it on my own, irrespective. Have 5 readers, 10 readers, I don't care. I want to do it, I will do it. And I'll keep my fingers crossed, hoping that at some point it catches the eye. But at the very least, one of the advantages I now have is if I've consistently followed a subject, let's say for about 6 months or a year or whatever, and I've built up a body of work, when I'm pitching a story to a newspaper, a magazine, or whatever it is, I can not only pitch what story I want to do and why I should be the one doing it, I can also link to all the work that I've done before. Right. So, as an editor, I like the story idea that you've sent. I want to be sure that you can pull it off. I just want to go and check what you've done just to make sure that you know how to do a story. I'm not going to end up with, some kind of fragmented, disjointed narrative. So build a portfolio just like photographers do, just like everybody else does. How do filmmakers make it into the big time? They make short films. So yeah.
Thank you, Prem. That was very helpful. And thanks for the session once again.
Not at all. Happy to.
Yeah, so I want to actually add to that and elaborate on that because it's something I feel quite strongly about and something which speaks a lot to my own experiences. One, I think that platforms are increasingly getting irrelevant these days. Advertising is just going down as sort of a means of revenue, and creators are finding independent ways to express themselves. So my extremely strong advice, and I want to also elaborate on why I am giving this advice for anyone who wants to be a writer, is don't look for a publication that I will pitch and I will do this. Instead, start your blog, maybe in the modern age, a newsletter, and go for it. Very briefly, let me elaborate why. Number one, it frees you from the conventions of whatever the styles or format of the particular publications might be. So you can try different things, find your voice, grow as a writer. Number two, you're not dependent on gatekeepers who might be beholden to a conventional way of thinking and might reject you for that reason. Number three, if you're just pitching to people and waiting to be accepted before you write, you're not writing enough. Whereas if you're writing on a blog or a newsletter, you are writing all the time, and that constant iteration is what makes for excellence. From my own personal example, I remember that, when I started India Uncut in 2003, I wrote 5 posts a day for about 5 years. At that time in journalism, I was just known as a cricket writer. I wrote about cricket for Cricinfo. Because of the blog and because of what it did for my brand and how it got me known, I ended up writing for the Wall Street Journal. I've written columns over time for Mint and Economic Times and Times of India and all of those. And today, in fact, I choose not to write for platforms because I am just happier reaching readers directly. Now, beginning writers will not necessarily have that privilege that they have an existing brand and an existing following and they can reach people directly. But I would still say that, as Prem said, build that body of work, not just so that you have a body of work to show people, but in the process of building that body of work, you will be writing, and that will make you so much better. And, and Prem, also with smoke signals, I think a lot of your most memorable writing, at least for me as a fan, was on your blog and not for any publication, right?
Yeah.
So our next question.
Yeah, I love that because, like I said, no gatekeepers. And I mean, to underline the point, Amit is a classic example of what happens when you consistently build a body of work. You're doing two things at the same time. One is increasing. In order to write, you need to read a lot, you need to absorb a lot, and all of that, right? So he's adding to his knowledge base as he writes. That is one. And so the Amit you see today is the product of 20 years of this kind of immersion. And the other thing that happens is that editors go where the audience is increasingly. So an Amit Varma will now be sought after simply because people know that when an Amit Varma writes, there is a ready-made audience for his work. There are people who recognize that byline for certain things, for a certain way of looking at the world, for a certain degree of expertise and stuff like that. And the only way you can get that, and guys, that point about style being something that evolves, mastery being something that evolves from constant iteration, it's a wonderful opportunity, right? I mean, I would rather not have an audience for my blog right now because I want to experiment with the styles. And I don't want somebody then comparing what I write today to something that I've written. And to Amit's point about my best, I think that the best writing I've done is on my blog. And that is because I was not writing for anybody. I was not writing for an editor who put me inside a box of this is what I want and in this many words. I was writing because I really wanted to, and that shows that this is actually coming from within and not because of an external trigger like an editor saying, "Hello, can you do this piece for me?" So yeah, I would recommend that every single one of you blogs, whatever format you're comfortable with. If you like video, do video. You're comfortable speaking, do podcasts. Just or like Amit, do everything. Newsletters now.
In fact, I would add
So
to that, and I would add one more point in favor of writing on your own platform, which is that all your body of work will be in one place. What happens if you write op-eds here, features there, yahan wahan likh diya? It's all dispersed. It's not archived anywhere. It is all written to different requirements and styles. Whereas if it is all on one blog or one newsletter, it's a body of work which builds up over time. People can binge on it. Like I just released an episode with Raghu Sanjay Lal Jetli, who writes a newsletter. So I just went to his newsletter archives and read all the 100 pieces he's written. Whereas had he just said, let me pitch to publications, then in this same period of time, he would have written 3 or 4 pieces. And that's all. And I would never have known of him. So, build your own platform. Don't be disheartened that shuru mein there may not be so many readers. It takes a lot of time, but then it's like compound growth. It's exponential. I often say creators sort of overestimate the short term and underestimate the long term. So don't write thinking that, oh, I will have 10,000 readers tomorrow itself. But over time, you'll be surprised at how amazing the long term benefits are. And let's move on to Brij now. Brij.
Thank you for a great session, Prem. And my question actually flows very beautifully into some of the points you have taken up right now around social media. So I know you a lot from Twitter and from Smoke Signals because I have been off cricket for quite some time. But your writings have followed up mostly through. For me, your visualization is a purple violetish person with a smoke coming out on the end, which is a Smoke Signals thing, right? And in that era of Twitter and blogging, there was this concept of citizen journalism which was coming through, which I found very interesting at the time. And I was really looking forward to it. And somewhere it kind of got probably in different directions and became more of propaganda and PR and all the other things. But do you think there is a place for citizen journalism even today? Is it a valid concept? And if it is, do you see anything that somebody like you, or even Amit for that matter, you have seen journalism in the real journalism idea, right? Like in the trenches and the rigors and the editorial activity and all that. But for somebody writing a blog or a newsletter and trying to be a journalist, is there some rigors that we should follow?
Well, a couple of ways of looking at it. One is the institutional way. For instance, if I was editing a publication of any kind, print, online, whatever, I would rely quite a lot on citizen journalism. I found the value of this, for instance, when that cyclone hit Orissa, when I was in Yahoo, for instance. We didn't have reporters in the field at that time. And we knew for about a day and a half that this was coming and it could possibly be cataclysmic. So what we had done was we had reached out to via social media, asking for people in Orissa, and through those people in Orissa, asking if they knew anyone in the cyclone's expected landfall area, in the cyclone's path, and all of that. And we'd collected this bunch of numbers. And as the cyclone started progressing, so we put them all in an Excel sheet, flagged by area, flagged by what they do for a living, all of that. And every single time, as the cyclone came in, one of us was reaching out to these people on WhatsApp or on messages, asking for the latest updates. And we found that we were constantly ahead even of the regular news channels, which depended on one reporter in some corner. So he didn't know what was happening, say, 5 kilometers away from him. Whereas we had the entire breadth of Orissa covered by people. So from an institutional point of view, that is one of the ways where I think citizen journalism helps me a lot, because I can get direct inputs from a particular area in much less time than it takes for me to take one of my scant reporting resources and get the person flown or driven or whatever it is to that particular point. Imagine having contacts, for instance, with the farmers who are now protesting and occupying various parts of this country. If you got inputs on a daily basis from all of them, you could build a daily narrative about what this life was like. I mean, it's now what, 2.5, 3 months that they've been sitting there. And instead of somebody just going and saying, Aap kitne din se baith rahe ho, and how do you feel? You could actually get them talking to you, and then you could stitch them at your end with just basic editorial skills and make fantastic timeline-driven narratives out of it. Now, from an individual point of view, where citizen journalism helps is, again, in building a body of work, in giving you something. So you might have an area of expertise, or you might have an area of interest, sport, for instance, or whatever it is, politics. But there's one thing, you remember that age-old bit of advice, write what you know, which keeps getting, people keep tossing that ball around. It's either write what you know, or, as I think, who was it who said this? I write to find out what I don't know about what I know. One of the famous writers, I forget where I saw that quote somewhere on Twitter, I think. But whatever those interests are, for instance, my interest might be sport, and sport is happening in all kinds of places. I'm sitting here and reporting on something that is happening in, where is it now? Ahmedabad. There is a limit to what I can do, right? But I will keep doing that because I want to build my body of work. But there is something I know very well, and that is Bangalore. I've been here for the last 10 years. There are local issues happening. There are local things happening. There are people of phenomenal interest doing extremely interesting things, which I could be writing about, and none better to write it than me. And somebody or the other is going to want these stories. So in terms of citizen journalism, if you're trying to get into that, what I would do is root myself in a place, in the place that I'm at, and which is where I have the most access, and start writing from that space, and gradually weave in my other interests, my larger interests. It's like when you go, for instance, when we have to go reporting and we go to a strange place, there are two ways of doing it. One is you go by GPS and say, oh, this is where it's happening, and you get there and you hope that you find what you're looking for. But the best way for me, find a dabba, find a little tea shop or something, get the locals involved in conversation and ask questions. What is it like? Where is this? What is happening? Nobody knows an area like the locals do. So for me, that is the first port of call always. And every single time it works. In some cases, the difficulty is disengaging from the conversation because they're so, into it that they'll just keep talking. But it's brilliant. It's an outstanding resource. It's just that you need to figure out how well to use it, and you need some guardrails. For instance, somebody could be just making things up. So if you're relying on a citizen journalist or a local journalist from somewhere, you have to have some form of fact-checking built in, or of cross-referencing built in, and all of that. But for me, it's the most exciting tool in reporting today.
Thank you.
And just to add to that, I did mention, I think, that we'd gone and explored the coastline in 2019, Arti Kumar Rao, and I had done that. One of the things that we do when we go out in the field is we constantly collect telephone numbers of everybody. The person who, if we met an interesting character in a tea shop, we'll take down his name and telephone number. And we have this in these little notebooks that I was showing you. We have notebooks dedicated to this. And one of the things both of us do is every month, we just cycle through these pages and make calls at random. Hi, how are you doing? What's happening? So we still have fishermen from all the way from Kanyakumari to Kollam who call us on a daily basis, or at least once or twice a week, to keep updating us about what is going on. So
that's
for me
real
as a
journalism.
reporter, local journalism is brilliant.
That's real journalism.
It's such an obvious resource to plug into.
No, and that's wonderful, Prem. Now we know why where your endless supply of fish comes from. And by the way, the quote you were thinking of is probably one that I used in my course. Is by the great Joan Didion, where she said, "I don't know what I think until I write it down," which are very wise words. And to very briefly add to the citizen journalism bit, number one, I got an early taste of it in the early days of my blog when, after the tsunami, I traveled down the coast of Tamil Nadu, and I was just blogging from there, and that was pre-Twitter and social media and all of that. And that got incredible traction. Like, I got more than 1 million views in a week because I was the only person on the ground, almost in a manner of speaking, who is not following the news cycle, who is just something happens, you write, something happens, you write, you're collecting stories, putting it out there. And the other point is that some people diss citizen journalism, saying, hey, but it will be so low quality, you need editorial filters, which is true. But the point is, I think the marketplace is a filter. Eventually citizen journalists will gain or lose credibility depending depending on the quality of the work that they do, and water will find its own level, and all of that. So on that note, let's move on to our next question. This is from Rita Mishra. Go ahead, Rita.
Hey Rita, how are you doing?
Hi, Prem. Thank you so much for talking to us. Uh, yeah, the question I'm asking you is on behalf of Raj. The first question is, in the age of 24/7 broadcasting and live tweeting, has the role of the writer changed?
Mhm.
And the second question is, do you find yourself writing differently because of the way the media has transformed?
The role of the writer, the approach of a writer to these subjects is constantly changed and evolved. For example, there was a time, if you're thinking of the say 1940s, 1950s. I'm by no means claiming that I was alive at that time, but basically from reading history books. Think of that time, the newspapers basically just bunged stuff in, facts collected from here, there, and everywhere, and it was all piled up into those few pages. They didn't even bother to really have separate pages for city news versus national news versus world news and sports and economy and things like that. It was just order of importance right through. What happened during that period was that first the widespread prevalence of radio, and secondly the entry of cable television. You're talking of the advanced markets like the United States in particular. These markets, radio and television started eating the newspaper's lunch because you could get the news out on that same day. You didn't have to wait for end of day production schedule and next day delivery to your doorstep. And newspapers struggled with that initially, and that is what led to what we today call narrative journalism, for instance, a long form journalism, because reporters and writers realized that providing the news alone wasn't enough. It was more necessary now to provide the kind of nuance, context, all of that was otherwise missing from, or which radio and television couldn't do as effectively. So it changed then. Today it's changing again because, like you said, for many reasons, right? We talked, I think, earlier about how in the early 2000s, those people who used to be, say, the primary audience for reader for ESPN, Cricinfo, when they first launched and all of that, which is fairly synchronous, by the way. Everybody keeps talking about my ball by ball commentary. ESPN was doing, Cricinfo was doing the exact same thing. And for the life of me, I can't remember who started this first or who did what and stuff. We were both doing it. But the point is, that kind of started changing once people started. So that initial audience went away. They started being able to see matches. And we had, by definition, to therefore not do the exact same thing in the exact same way, because who was going to read you? And what is the point? So the descriptive kind of writing that I spoke about earlier in response to, I think, Amit's question and also something that somebody else asked, pretty much became irrelevant once people started being able to see things for themselves. So yeah, we've all had to change, or at least those of us who are not functioning purely in a mechanical muscle memory fashion have changed and continue to change, because I don't know what, for instance, I remember I was on Clubhouse one day when a match was on, and there were people in real time not only telling each other about what was happening, but also opinionating about that and discussing it and raising questions and getting it answered by experts, and all sorts of things was going on. And I was listening to all of that quietly and wondering, okay, how is this going to change what I do? Because how as hell these things will. Twitter threads and Clubhouse discussions and live blogs, and so much of it has come about recently that one of the interesting things about journalism is, until the internet came along, the evolution cycle was fairly extended. So to give you an example, in print, after the days of facsimile publishing, where you could just make a home page here and send it out to various printing houses, various printing presses across your landscape, and get them all printed and therefore speed up delivery, there's been no significant development in terms of technology. So you're talking of something like 60 to 70 years where the technology has been static. So even the laziest or the most inefficient of publishing houses have had time to understand this and to catch up with it. What's happening with the internet is that technological changes are so rapid. There's literally somebody sitting in a garage someplace right now creating something that could be the next big thing and which could change this world as we know it today, the internet ecosystem as we know it today, right? So what today we are having to do is not think in terms of decade long cycles of change, but of day long or week long cycles. And having that flexibility to be aware of what is popping up in the space, what new tools are coming, what technologies are coming. I mean, 5 years ago, would we have imagined this kind of an ecosystem where we could have this kind of a conversation? We wouldn't. 3 years ago, we didn't even think about it. Now we're doing exactly that, right? Change is happening dramatically, and I think the people who will survive and thrive are those who are aware of these changes and what that means and adapt in real time. So to Raj's second question, have I had to change, or have we were working in this field had to change? Yeah, it's either change or become irrelevant. I mean, why would I write a descriptive match report today? Why would you want to read it? You saw the match. I want to show you things you didn't see. Hopefully that satisfies Raj.
Sure, Prem.
And then,
Thank
I mean,
you
if
so
he has
much.
any additional questions, you can always ping me on WhatsApp. So, yeah.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. And to sort of underscore the point that you made, the point that we were making earlier about having your own platform. This is another reason you should have your own platform and do your own thing, because these old fogies, these big media houses have no clue what the hell is going on. Over the last 10 years, the way we consume information, discover information, filter information has changed completely. And these media houses, are living in some previous century. So, do your own thing, explore every new medium. Yeah, Prem?
No, I remember when you launched your podcast and you told me that you were going to do it early days, and we had a long conversation about that. But I think I told you this later. I was kind of skeptical in the sense of, I was like, really, who's going to listen to an hour-long conversation, which was the idea at that time, and now you've gone to what, 5 hours or something. But I remember being skeptical, and then after a few episodes and watching how people were interacting with that, I had to kick myself and say, this is exactly what I've been warning myself about. Don't dismiss something till you try it out, right? And in the case of podcasts, I was initially dismissive until you came along and showed the value.
That's why I would say
And it's
never be.
brilliant fun, right? Who wants to do the same thing over and over again?
That's why I would say, Prem, never be dismissive of any. Be dismissive of any medium if you want to, but not of your friends. You should never dismiss me. We'll now go on to a question from Abhijit.
So I was saying, thank you for doing this, and Amit for getting Prem on, and Brij for doing all the heavy lifting. I did email Prem on this, and he said that I'd rather discuss this here. So Prem, like on the email, I've been struggling to make something new, and Amit has been telling that I just need to get it done, but I'm really not happy with whatever I do. And then I happened to attend a workshop on Mahabharata and got introduced to this Malayalam classic, Eninya Nurangate. And on a whim, I began translating. And for me, it was writing practice, and I also felt I was learning and improving. I could sort of see that in my own thing. So what the question for you, Prem, is, and I know you're the right person, is there a good way to go about it? Translating some work, will it harm my style? Will it limit my voice? Will it limit my voice from emerging and coming out and realizing what it is? So that's what I wanted to ask you. Is it a good way to go about doing it?
Well, a couple of things here, actually. You started by saying that you wanted to write and you did write and you weren't happy with what you did. And therefore, you're looking at translation as an alternate means of maybe developing your writing muscles or whatever it is. What I would say first and foremost is it doesn't come right the first time. It doesn't come right the first 20 times sometimes. But don't give up on the writing that you started doing because you wanted to do it. because at some point it'll break loose and it'll fall together for you. But if you shelve it, it's gone. It's gone for keeps. Um, so I wouldn't give up on whatever kind of writing it is that you want to do, whatever kind of writing it is that some internal prompt asked you to attempt in the first place. I would just keep at it. I wouldn't be dismissive of it so much as I would work it through to the end of whatever the piece is or the book is or whatever. Then I would go back and I would look at it, and I would probably list down the reasons for my dissatisfaction with it, and then figure out how to get better or how to do this better. I think we give up way too early, and I think that spoils that keeps a lot of us from being who we really can be. To the question about translation, and it's funny that you brought up Ininya Norangate, because as a couple of friends who know me will tell you, I started trying to translate Ininya Norangate sometime in 2012. I've gone through 5 drafts so far, each of them 60, 65, 70,000 words. I've junked them all. I haven't been happy with, as since you've read the book, you know that it's not just a storyline, it is the complex inner thoughts and feelings and emotions, all of it, which makes that book so compelling. And I've just not been able to get the right tone, I guess, the right voice, because I can't write in my voice. This is entirely different. And I remember I discussed this with Nilanjana, and she said, listen, don't push it. Just take the characters into your home and let them live with you for a while, and you get comfortable with them, let them get comfortable with you, and their voice will emerge. And I think somewhere recently, my nth draft that I started, I'm getting slightly more comfortable with how it's turning out. Is translation a good way to break out of your writing rut? This habit of bailing out of something because it doesn't seem to be working at that particular point can affect you no matter what you're doing. So if you use translation as a means of breaking out of whatever you think was stopping you from doing original writing, you will come to a point in the translation where you say, look, this is not working for whatever reason, and you will bail out of that also. And one thing I would urge you to do is, if you've done some kind of original writing, keep at it. Sure, do translations. It's fun. It allows you to explore different ways of thinking of your writing. It allows you to explore the craft from a different dimension, because now you can't be you. You have to be that writer, and you have to be the character in that book has to speak in a way that writer has imposed on that character. So when we talk about voice, there are multiple voices, right? There is the voice of the story, there is the voice of a character, there is the voice of the author. All of that fuses together. We think of voice just as, partly my mistake, I just spoke about how I write from an internal point of view, but I also have to be faithful to the voice of the character and stuff. I'll circle back to what I said in the beginning. Don't give up on your first impulse. Keep doing that. And on the side, you want to do translation, sure, it'll teach you things. Any form of writing will teach you something.
Thank you so much, Prem. Thank you.
Yeah, and to add to that, what I would say is that, like you said, Prem, every form of writing teaches you something, and I think translation can be especially useful because it forces you to be mindful of things you weren't mindful of earlier. So you start taking a granular look at language. You start thinking about word choices and rhythm and all of that. And I had a great episode of The Seen and the Unseen with the great translator Arunava Sinha, where he elaborated on this. We'll link it from the show notes down below. And as far as giving up because your first draft wasn't good is concerned, I'm reminded of something Megan McArdle tweeted on Twitter recently, when she said that it was a thread where somebody asked about what have you learned in your writing career and all, what is the one thing, and she said this quote, you can rewrite garbage, you can't rewrite nothing. Stop quote. So that imperative of getting it done is something that I would stress upon. Our next question now is from Anirban.
Hi, Prem. Such a pleasure to say hello to you. I have been reading your your work on Rediff back from the time that I first got access to the internet. So this is such a privilege. Thank you. One of the things I read besides your cricket commentary and your analysis of the day's play was that you went on to do a translation of M.T. Vasudevan Nayar's work, Malayalam work, Randamusam, which was essentially a retelling of the Mahabharata through Bhim's perspective. I remember refreshing the Rediff browser regularly, on it, just looking for the next installment of that story. I just want to know why did you stop? Why haven't you done more of that? Or have I not read enough? But I just wanted to get a sense of what your take on translations is, which you've broadly answered, but more than that, on retelling of timeless tales, old tales. And which is sort of a switch from the kind of work that you do, which is focus on matches and a focus on trying to make more permanent the temporal. But here we're talking about, I don't know, I've run out of words.
Yeah, I think there were 3 or 4 things that kind of came together that led me to do that thing. One was when I was in New York, I'd come across this professor who was teaching at an MFA program in one of the New York universities. And we got to the stage where we would occasionally meet for coffee and stuff. And one day we were talking about writing in general and about my writing in particular. And she asked me for some samples of what I had done. She took the trouble to read that and then called me up and fixed a coffee date. And when I went there, she gave me the stack of Xeroxes of stories. I don't remember the exact year. I think it was 1972. There was a heavyweight fight in Chicago between Sonny Liston and James Patterson. No heavyweight fight had taken place for quite some time. This was the heyday of boxing coverage. All the greats were writing. And one of the things that if you think back to that era, boxing was so popular a sport and made for such gripping writing that even literateurs or people who were into other forms of literature were drawn into writing on boxing. Think of the names. Joyce Carol Oates has written on boxing. Jack London has written on boxing. Paul Gallico has written on boxing. People like that. So this was one fight. And the funny part about the fight was Sonny Liston had come out of jail. So he wasn't interested in talking to the press. Floyd Patterson is probably the most inarticulate of heavyweight boxers, or at least champion heavyweight boxers there's ever been. Now, because there was no fight, because boxing coverage was so big at that time, all the major media houses sent their best writers to cover this fight, and they landed up a week before the fight and realized that there was nothing they could do. They could go ringside and watch these guys spar in their respective camps, but neither of them was speaking. Then finally the fight itself happened, and the fight lasted for 1 minute and 20. Listen, Floyd Patterson out. At the end of it all, Norman Mailer wrote a 20,000 word piece. Now, what this teacher had given me was a set of about 8 or 10 pieces, all related to the fight, all written by people like Jimmy Cannon, who was then the emeritus professor of boxing reporters, for instance. And there was Jimmy Breslin, who made a habit of writing about race and writing brilliantly about race. Norman Mailer, the young Gay Tallies was there. Pretty much the pantheon was present at the ringside, and look what they had to work with. 1 hour and 23 minutes. 1 minute and 23 seconds worth of boxing. And what struck me when I read this collection was how every single piece differed from the other pieces. Jimmy Breslin, for instance, talked about how Floyd Patterson was a good Negro. I'm using this term because it was used in that era. I know connotations today, but versus Sonny Liston being set up as the thing, and the white man enjoying the spectacle of, sorry, I think it's unstable. Yeah, the white man enjoying the spectacle of the good Negro going up against the bad Negro, all of that. That started, and the point that this professor made to me was, she said, I read your work and I realized that, okay, you're quick to spot a story and you're quick to write it. What I want you to do is next time, once you have a story in your head, park it there and then walk around the subject a little bit. See if there are other angles and other perspectives that you can view it from. Maybe there is a more compelling piece if you approach it from a lateral sort of point of view or whatever. So that stuck. Randamuram, like I said right at the beginning, I grew up in a family of storytellers, and the stories of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana were common currency at home. So I knew those stories before I read those stories. And then I started reading the retellings. Along with that, I've always been, or I started getting increasingly fascinated with perspective retellings. So it started with the Iliad, reading things like, say, Madeline Miller's The Song of Achilles, for instance. Even somebody like, there's a guy, I forget his first name now. My memory is keeping pace with my age, I guess. Gemmell, his surname is. He wrote a trilogy based on the Iliad. There have been n number of perspective tellings of the Iliad. Similarly, of the Mahabharata, you're thinking of, say, Shivaji Savant's Mrityunjaya, for instance. You're thinking of the many works that Arshia Satar has written, and books like Yajnaseni, even the book that I mentioned earlier, Iniyan Orangate by P.K. Balakrishnan, is a retelling of the Mahabharata from primarily Draupadi's point of view. Other characters also come in. When you shift the perspective, or when you see a known story from another's point of view, it suddenly sort of, it refreshes the story. It gives you an opportunity to explore motivations and the inner workings of these characters in a way that the top-down 30,000 feet up story does not allow you to do, because there you're concerned with what happened. The omniscient narrator rarely has an insight into the minds of the people who are performing these actions. He can sit up there on top of that mountain that Homer sat upon and see the plain of Troy, but that's about it. Once you get down into a perspective, if you tell the story of the combat between Achilles and Hector from, say, Hector's point of view, everything changes. When you tell it from Achilles' point of view, it changes. So perspective retelling became a fascination, and I started reading every example of that genre that I could find. And at some point, it was that trigger, right? You want to keep experimenting. You want to see what it takes. So fiction is not really my thing. But it suddenly occurred to me that Randamuram, which I was just randomly going through my bookshelf, I saw that book, I started reading it again. And I realized why I was so fascinated with it the first time around. So I wanted to redo it into a more modern idiom, the blog post, which is more like a television serial narrative. You can't just write 2,000 words and stop wherever that 2,000 word limit comes up. So you have to write like a television serial. You have to start with a hook and you have to end with a hook to make you come back the next day. So it gave me an opportunity to experiment with all sorts of things, with that kind of, spiraling narrative, for instance, with perspective retelling, and what can I then imagine. So it wasn't a translation so much as transcreation. The storyline is M.T. Vasudevan Iyer's, and I've added a whole lot of stuff to it. But basically, it was an experiment. I did that. And like I said, I have been working on another translation for quite a long time, but it hasn't fallen into place the way I want it to. It's a brilliant work, and I don't want to do injustice to that writer, if you will. So maybe someday it'll come together and then it'll come out in the public domain. But I'm still working on it.
Wonderful. I would love to get myself a copy of that book. I'll definitely. I haven't paid you anything for all the work that you've produced, that I've consumed, and
I'll send you a check some point.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
Take care.
okay, all right. Thank you.
Yes.
See ya.
Yeah, and resonant words by Anirban, because in his tone, I felt that that urgent plea that other fans of yourself, like I share, that where are the books? Everyone, I want to tell the whole world. I keep telling Prem, bro, you should have written 10 books by now. What are you doing? I have been saying this since 2001. So
Yeah,
we should start some
I know.
campaign or some kind of group that make Prem Panicker write those books, because at his level of given how prolific the gentleman is, once they start coming out one by one, we'll have a lot of fun. But for now, let's move on now to a question by Sanjay Vadwani. Sanjay, go right ahead.
Hey Sanjay, how are you doing?
Hi, Prem. Thank you for agreeing to do this. It's so good to speak to you. My question is, we talk about polarization, but the sports community takes it to a whole different level with their tribal allegiances to sporting teams or cities, countries. So, what is your advice to writers to reach out and engage to the broadly outside of our own echo chambers? Right, to change minds rather than preach the converted.
I don't know how to answer that really, because I don't write to change minds. Um, I write to tell stories, and hopefully, if I get the story right, if I've done justice to the material I'm drawing on to tell that story, people who read it might get their minds open uh, to an alternate point of view if what I've written differs. I remember uh, one of those little moments of joy was when in the early days of writing about cricket, I got this mail from one of the doyens of the cricket writing community. I haven't got his permission, so I'm not using his name. Who said, "In matters cricketing, much as my head disagrees with you, my heart loves the passion and the thing with which you write." And I thought, okay, that's fine. Disagreement is going to be there. We're not going to see eye to eye about everything. Amit is a friend of over 20 years. It's not necessary that I and he agree on matters cricketing or otherwise. There are times when we differ. Um, I think it becomes a problem if you start writing to change minds, because then you're forcing a narrative for a particular purpose as opposed to allowing yourself to go with the narrative as it exists. I think changing minds is a question of, over time it can happen if over a period of time your work is consistently honest. It is coming from a place of belief. If you're writing what you truly feel, and I made this point earlier, it's worth repeating. People are brilliant at spotting fakes. We think of the audience as some kind of passive recipient of whatever we put out. That's not true. They immediately spot it. I gave you the example of somebody who did a parody match report of mine to make the point that I've started phoning it in. Uh, People are receptive. Increasingly, thanks to social media, they're quite vocal about telling you exactly where you get off. I think they will spot it if you're trying to fashion an argument for that kind of purpose. I want to convince you about something that you're not otherwise convinced by. I think the only way to convince, I don't even see why we are writing to convince other people. Everybody takes information that is available and process it according to their own values and instinct and upbringing and all of that, and they come to different conclusions, and that is fine. What we can hope to do is, if we are honest enough, if we are true enough, if we are compelling enough in the way we tell our stories or fashion arguments, people who think differently from you will at the same time at least give you the courtesy of reading you as well, to see what you have to say, and maybe they'll engage with you and tell you you're stupid, but they will engage with your piece, and that's good enough for me. Convincing people is not what I'm in this business for. I keep reminding myself of that, and I'll keep repeating that ad infinitum. I'm here to tell stories. What you take away from those stories is your business. If we see eye to eye, I'm happy. If you disagree and you want to engage with me and tell me this is why I think you're stupid, that's fine. We can have a discussion. If you just want to abuse me, I can walk away. So, yeah.
No, makes sense. I'll just add that I joined this community after reading your testimonial of Amit's course. So I would say you're good at changing minds.
Ah, okay. Thank you. Amit owes me some money now.
That's a profitable mind-changing moment for me right there. So thank you, Prem. Someone has disagreed with you and convinced you to change your mind about not being able to change minds. And our next question is from Rajesh. Rajesh, go ahead.
Hi, Prem. Thanks for making time for this session. This has been absolutely fascinating. I have a brief question and a little bit of a meta question with that. My brief question is, sports writing, I guess any sports event is temporal in nature, so you write about it. And even if it's been a great game, it's been fascinating, tomorrow people's mind is somewhere else. So my first question is, like, how much should a writer worry about writing it in such a way that, like, what's the mindset the writer should have to make the piece a little more timeless, like something that can be enjoyed even after a year, for example. And the question really is, like, how much should the writer worry about that aspect when planning or writing the piece? Thank you.
Yeah. The thing with sports writing in particular is there are a lot of dissonant thoughts that you have to hold in your head at the same time and still somehow manage to function, which apparently is a good test of intelligence. One of them is all of us are seeing the exact same event, and yet I have the arrogance or the ego to presume that what I have to say about that event actually matters to the rest of you who've also seen that same event, right? So there is a certain ego involved in that. At the same time, you also have to have that complete lack of ego to be able to step aside and let the story tell itself. That is one of those things. The other one is, like you said, the game is ephemeral. Tomorrow doesn't matter. And you know that going in. And at the same time, you also have to write as if it all mattered, because otherwise you're not doing justice to the event itself. Sure, what you write today could be forgotten tomorrow, but sometimes because and ultimately one of the things that you realize is something that you write can be remembered like years later, and people will keep repeatedly bringing it up, and you step back, and that is where you look at why people remember this. It is not because of the way you wrote, it is because of the compelling nature of the event itself. And you at that time were smart enough to see how compelling that was and get out of the way of that particular event. Let the event have its voice and have its space to breathe. And if you did that, people who relived that particular occasion through you and through your writing, remember that. You write hundreds of pieces. I mean, given the way sport is, whichever sport you're covering, you've got literally dozens of events in a given year. There is no way that you can write for eternity on every one of these. What you can do is hope that when those magical moments appear, you were alert and you were watching, and you were sensitized to the importance of that moment, and you have that little bit of skill that you need to do whatever justice to it. After that, what happens to it is out of your hands, and that is true of any writing, right? I mean, you could write the world's greatest novel and nobody reads it. You can't get into a piece of writing thinking, will this last? Will somebody still feel the same way next week when they read it? You just write because you want to write, or you just write because that moment is worth writing. I don't care if nobody reads the piece that I wrote about Hanuma Vihari and Ashwin dragging an entire family out of their deep grief with the way they lasted that session in the penultimate test in Australia. But at that point, it was deeply felt. I wanted to write it. I wrote it, and it lasts for as long as it lasts.
Thank you, Prem.
Just to add to that,
Yeah.
I think Amit and I actually once spoke about this. I think it was on email or in person. I forget what. People still my 2001 report on VVS Lakshman and Rahul Dravid's one day of batting at the Eden Gardens. I read that and I cringe. The intro was hack. It was hack work. It was really, really bad. I didn't really, it was more about me writing it than about letting the event speak for itself. But people still keep dragging it up every now and again, saying, "Oh, I have memories of the speech that you wrote that day." So yeah, why do people still remember that? Because that was a once in a lifetime event. You just happen to be lucky enough to be watching it and to be given a platform to write about it. So you're not making something immortal. You just happen to be ringside when something immortal happened.
So you should be prepared
Yeah.
for those moments to just come, appear,
Mhm.
and you're right. You're in the right place at the right time. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and I would add to what you know what you to Rajesh's question and to what Prem said, and just point out that, listen, just through the conversation that we've had over the last couple of hours or more, we've been referring to so many old pieces. Prem referred to Liebling's work, Normal Mailer's work, Gate Elise's work. Those are memorable, and many of those at the time the person might not have thought of posterity. I think when Prem wrote his ball by ball commentary for Rediff in those years, he wasn't thinking of posterity. He was in the moment, trying to capture the moment, do the best he can. And yet, we've seen the outpouring of emotion from people 25 years later who are remembering that, or who say that we used to keep refreshing the screen. So I think posterity is something that takes care of itself. In any case, in the long run, we are all dead, as a great cricket writer John Maynard Keynes said. So you just got to do what you do. Our next question now is from Shakil. Shakil, go ahead.
Hey,
So
Shakil.
thank you. Thank you, Amit sir, at first, and Brij for making this event possible, and thank you, Prem sir, for sharing your insights. So my question is about style and voice that you were referring to. So does style corrupt voice? Like Amit Varma, in his meditation on form says how the way we write corrupts our inner voice. Okay, and writing as a process itself is subvocalizing, where we revisit our initial experiences, and that adds some layers of emotions that we feel when we rethink of those things that happen. And does that corrupt the voice again? And ultimately, are writers susceptible to what we call social desirability bias? And if they are susceptible to that, is that the reason why they indulge in what we can call preference falsification? Uh, so that's the question.
What happened just now was that I'm completely all at sea because I've never thought about all of these things. Um, I
if
think
if
the
I can if I
overall,
can if I can clarify, I think Shakil was referring to an essay I wrote called "A Meditation on Form," and I'll elaborate on his question for you, because I think I know where he's coming from. Well, which was essentially, that essay was all about how the form can often determine the content and therefore change the person. For example, if I am every day writing an 80-word news report, for a tabloid, I will write in a particular kind of way, look for a particular kind of content, think in a particular kind of content, and become a certain kind of person. Very different from if I was writing long reads. Similarly, if I was doing a 5-minute podcast, I could just ask shallow questions, not delve deep. But a longer format forces me to delve deep. That changes the content, that changes the person, and therefore that changes the voice. So I think those imperatives are what Shakil is talking about. Am I correct?
Yes, sir.
Great.
yeah. So that's going to happen anyways. The for all that you say that your voice is your own and that is what you're going to use all the time. There are times when you will have to subsume your natural voice to external imperatives. Amit made the point just now about the difference between, say, writing constantly for a tabloid versus maybe for the Wall Street, or doing a 5-minute podcast for a quick radio soundbite versus doing the 2 hour, 3 hour kind of podcast that he normally does. That is one way it happens. Another way it happens is when it is. Um, so, for instance, we talked earlier about. I think I mentioned that the writing I have done that I've liked the best is the writing on my blog, because there is no imperative whatsoever, except the internal imperative of wanting to say something about a particular event, or a particular, or to vocalize a particular thought. Nothing else dictates how I write on that space, because it is mine. There is no external, there is no gatekeeper, there is no moral guardian standing there saying you can't do this or that. Whereas if I have to write and it has happened at times that I have written something on the blog, and there has been a media house that has wanted to carry the same piece, but have asked me to change words or sentences that were in the original piece that I'd written. The original piece was my free, unfettered expression of my thoughts in my own voice. There, I'm subservient to a sort of institutional voice, if you will. That particular media house does not want certain things said in certain ways. Maybe it is the strength of tone, or it could be the language itself. And they ask for changes. I mean, I basically can't be bothered picking up a blog post and rewriting it to suit somebody else's sensibilities. So I usually say no. But these are the times when external influences do, if not alter your voice, at least cause you to limit its reach, for instance, or its throw. You hear singers talking about the throw of their voice, which is basically their ability, without going full throated, to project their voice right to the back of the audience. Similarly, when you're writing in prose, there is a throw. There is a way you're able to project emotions and uh, emotions particularly onto a screen, and somebody else who's consuming it in black and white still feels that same way. And there will be times, because of external reasons, that you're not able to do that, or you're not allowed to do that, and then you either say no, or you do what is required. But yes, it can happen. If that was the primary the core of the question, yes, it can happen. It's natural.
So, within that context, I asked two more questions. One was related to the process of writing itself. Before deciding the style, the process of writing itself requires the person to revisit his experience. And while he is revisiting his experience, he may happen to engage in the kind of emotions by that act of remembering something, and that influences the way in which he writes it later. So, does that not corrupt the act of revisiting the experience for the sake of writing? Does that not corrupt our inner voice?
I don't think so. Uh, I think it's not revisiting it for an external reason. I think this is how it works, right? That there is an event, or there is something that is worth writing about, and I happen to be a witness to that event. I have certain thoughts. I have a way of processing whatever that thing is, and left to myself, there is a way that I would have written it. But there might be times when, for instance, Amit has asked me to write for him when he was in cricket form. While uh, Amit is a highly accomplished editor, which is the one thing that he doesn't do much of these days. But he's never told me exactly how I'm supposed to write or what tone I'm supposed to talk to. There are certain broad guidelines. This is what I want you to talk about, which need not necessarily be what I wanted to talk about in the first place. It's part of the same event, but he wants a particular piece on a particular aspect of that, for example. At that point, I'm merely deriving from my overall experience of that event and my overall thoughts that which relates to a platform where this is going to be published. So here I'm not just letting the event speak for itself. There are constraints, there are boundaries, there are filters. It does not necessarily change my voice. It merely makes me work within a particular frame. I mean, the pieces that I've written for external publications, for other editors, I don't think my voice differs radically from the voice that I use when I'm writing my blog post or whatever. What I do work under are certain other constraints. For instance, I might have written much longer. For example, I was writing for myself, or it could be that I have to focus. An example, in 2006, I was asked by Reed uh, to do reports on the T20 World Cup of that time. I don't want to do match reports. I want to just look at discrete moments and write what I feel about them. And what Reed wanted was something that related to what I had done with Reed previously, the kind of match report. So at some point, we had to arrive at a wire media. So what I ended up writing was not really match reports, but yeah, it looked at the key moments, it looked at the pivotal points of the match and stuff, and I surrounded it with the kind of writing I wanted to do. So that is not my unfettered voice. It is a voice that has been hemmed in a little bit, or hedged in, or shaped by external requirements. But the underlying way of processing that event, the underlying way of feeling and thinking and all of that, that remains unchanged, or should, I guess.
So one last question related to this. It was about that external requirement. Is optimizing for the reader itself an act of engaging with that external requirement? So in that sense, a writer is susceptible to social desirability bias, and maybe that leads a writer to commit errors like preference falsification, writing something that which he may not believe in, but he or she thinks that that will make him famous, irrespective of publishing it on a blog or somewhere in editorial a page of a newspaper.
So I really would want to leave this question aside, not because I think it is it's not meant in a pejorative sense. The reason I said that is I honestly haven't ever cared, nor do I care right now, how many readers read this and find it good or bad or indifferent. It doesn't matter. I'm not writing for the reader. I'm writing for I'm writing a story, and I'm letting that story out into the world. And what happens to it is its business. I have seen fairly mediocre works getting celebrated. I've seen great works sometimes not get recognition at that point in time or whatever. I don't see the sense of what is called optimizing for the reader. There are times when you optimize for certain things. I think in Amit's class, he makes the point about if you're writing an op-ed, you can't write that like a work of fiction, or you can't use a lot of dialogue or whatever. If you're writing an editorial, you have to write it in a particular fashion. That kind of optimization is based on not just what you're writing about, but context of what the background of that piece is. All of that kind of optimization. But optimizing in order to be liked by the reader, if you want to be universally loved, I would suggest that writing is not the way to do it. At least honest writing is not the way to do it, because no matter what you say, what position you take about whatever it is, there will be people who disagree, and you start worrying about that. You will be I could think of examples from contemporary journalism where people tack right one day and tack left one day and try to please both sides, and somewhere fall between all these tools and don't even know who they are anymore. I don't see where that makes any kind of sense. So that is why I said I don't want to answer the actual question. I'm merely saying I'm not qualified to answer that because I don't have an experience of writing for applause or for readers' ratification, if you will.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, I would just add to that by saying that Prem, this is like you are a virtuous. You're like someone who's saying I can't answer a question about vice because I myself am virtuous. Sounds a little bit like that. And I would very quickly take a shot at Shakil's question and say, number one, as Prem said, people have inbuilt bullshit detectors. They can make out when you're not being authentic to yourself and when you're bullshitting. And number two, when you speak about the social desirability bias, a keyword there is social. Society is too complicated for us to figure out. And if you think that writing in a particular way will please other people, you will mostly find that you are wrong. People build up a following when they have distinct individual voices and they stick true to the kind of writing they do, like Prem or Liebling or Mailer or whoever. Any great writer is distinctive that way. Our next question comes from Nishant.
Thank you so much for this session. I really enjoy your work as a sports writer and also following you on Twitter for the moment by moment updates. And my question has to do sort of with that. You mentioned just now about how sports writing is inherently ephemeral and you can't think of posterity because you're writing in the moment. So I wonder about this need for timeliness and seizing the opportunity and how that shapes into the natural instinct to procrastinate as a writer. From your decades of experience, can you give me some tricks of how you have learned to outwit your own procrastination for the things you want to do?
I procrastinate a lot. As Amit pointed out earlier, I've been procrastinating about writing one book that he's asked for at least 20 years. Um, so I'm not sure that I have a lot of tips on how to avoid procrastination. If your question is about being in that moment and using that moment, um, I think it is, you do it if you want to do it. It's not like, so here's the thing. Since you said you follow me on Twitter, before the Australia tour, do you remember me posting about cricket for a very, very long time? I haven't posted anything at all. It's not that India wasn't playing. It's not that interesting things weren't happening. It is just that I wasn't involved enough at that time. I was doing other things.
Mhm.
And so and I don't feel the compulsion to be the ongoing voice of cricket or whatever. So every time there is a match, I'm not going to be on Twitter. In fact, after the tests, particularly for the T20s, very unlikely that you will find me there, because I mean it leaves me cold. That form of the game, I watch it for entertainment, but that's about it. So I don't think it is about, procrastinating. I think it is about, you will do it if you want to do it. So that wanting comes first. I wanted to follow Test cricket because it's been a very, very long time since we've had any, and the cricket series that restarted it is the one against Australia, which always makes for compelling sort of viewing. So I got back into that, and this just continued on from the other. And I think one of the only reasons, it's not that I thought this was going to be a series that matches the Australia one. The reason I watch is because I see it as part of an ongoing narrative. In Australia, you had a team of improbables pulling off heist after heist, because after the first match you lose your captain, the next match you lose your most influential bowlers, people who were there for basically uh, net duties, etc., suddenly come and take the limelight, do well, and it's still continuing. I mean, remember in the first test of this series there was a guy called Shahbaz Nadeem who bowled, and after that we haven't even heard him. Nobody's even talking about him. I find this fascinating, and at some point there is something that I want to do with that, which is why I'm following it. And because I'm following it, and because I like the company of like-minded cricket fans, I spend time on Twitter and I post, and that's about it. Because if you notice, when I post, there are people commenting on the post, and then I respond to that, and it becomes the kind of conversation that in these COVID times you miss, because you're not watching it with a lot of friends.
Right. And, we have reached pretty much the end of this session. Now, some of you might say that, hey, this is as long as a Seen and the Unseen episode. But no, that's a wrong frame of reference. We are talking to Prem Panicker here. This is as long as one of those pieces he used to write for Rediff. And who knows if this will be memorable, but those certainly were. Now, I want to, besides thanking all of you for attending and asking questions, 3 specific thank yous I must get through. One is to our good friend Brij Kartha, who has administered this entire session. This session today has happened because of him. He got all the questions together, with like a class monitor with a ruler in hand, sabko line mein lagaya, all of that. So unseen behind the scenes work. So thank you for that. I want to thank Vartika Singh, who did not show herself asking a question or such like, but she is the one who's been editing these sessions and sprucing them up for YouTube and making people like us look presentable. Just imagine. And finally, I want to thank Prem Panicker for being so incredibly generous with his time and insights. There is no other way to say this but in a filmy way, that Prem, hum sab Prem ke deewane hain. So thank you for giving us the time, and more power to you.
Thanks, Amit. And Bridge, thanks a bunch. That went off smoothly, and that's entirely your doing. I've been watching what you were doing with the Google Sheets and stuff, and your on the chat, your constant intervention saying, okay, you're up next, and this is what you have to do, and stuff like that. And I was wondering how you were posting the same thing over and over again to different people. Thanks a bunch for that, Amit. Thanks again, I mean, for having me on. Like I keep telling you, you're a rock star in what you do, and it's always a pleasure. And so everybody on the community, this great fun, and let's not, this vote of thanks business just I think it's worth pointing out that I'm not exactly an outsider who's come in to do this session. I'm part of your community. So it's just hanging out with folks.
ये सिलसिला चलता रहेगा. On that note, thank you everyone who's watching this on YouTube. Also, the link for my course is below, the art of clear writing. So feel free to sign up and join this wonderful community. And we'll, in any case, we will have more wonderful conversations like this, and we'll keep posting them on YouTube. So do subscribe to our channel. Thank you for listening.